Hello there and welcome to this quiet corner where time moves differently and the ancient world is allowed to breathe without the rush of modern life. Tonight we're not staying in the familiar present. We're stepping back through deep time to an Earth so extraordinary that it challenges everything we think we know about our planet. This is a journey into the Mesozoic Era, a span of time that stretched across 186 million years when our world was ruled by giants, when continents drifted like slow ships across warming seas, and when life experimented with forms so alien they seemed pulled from imagination itself. The Mesozoic. You may have heard fragments of this name whispered in museums, glimpsed it in documentaries about prehistoric life, or seen it written beneath the skeletons of creatures that once walked where you now stand. Yet few pause to truly imagine what it would have felt like to breathe that ancient air, to stand beneath skies unlike any we know today, to witness landscapes where flowers had not yet been invented, and where the very concept of grass was still millions of years in the future. This was the Age of Reptiles, a time when Earth belonged to creatures that moved with a different rhythm than the mammals that would later inherit their world. It was an era that began in the shadows of the greatest extinction in planetary history and ended with an apocalypse written in fire and darkness. Between these bookends of catastrophe lay three distinct periods: the Triassic, when life cautiously rebuilt itself from near total annihilation; the Jurassic, when giants walked among towering forests under humid skies; and the Cretaceous, when the planet reached a warmth and diversity that would never be seen again. To understand this world, you must first abandon the map that exists in your mind. The continents were not where they are now. The climate was not what it is today. The very air was different, thicker with moisture in some ages, heavy with volcanic gases in others. There were no ice caps gleaming white at the poles. Instead, palm trees and cycads swayed in polar breezes, while shallow seas flooded vast stretches of what would one day become dry land. This was a greenhouse Earth, a planet where the tropics extended far beyond their modern boundaries, and where the temperature gradient from equator to poles was gentler than anything we experience now. The oceans were warm and shallow, teeming with creatures that have no modern equivalents. Marine reptiles as long as modern whales cruised through waters where ammonites spiraled in their millions and where the first true sharks perfected their ancient design. On land, the story was even more extraordinary. This was when reptiles discovered gigantism, when natural selection pushed some lineages towards sizes that seem impossible until you see their fossilized remains. Sauropod dinosaurs stretched their necks toward canopies over 30 meters high, their footsteps shaking the ground with each deliberate step. Predators evolved to match them, developing jaws that could crush bone and claws that could tear through hide thicker than modern armor. But the Mesozoic was not only about size, it was about innovation. This was when life invented flight independently, 3 separate times. First in the pterosaurs, whose membranous wings carried them across ancient skies, then in the birds, who emerged from the fart dinosaurs with feathers that began as insulation, but became the key to conquering the air, and finally in the insects, who perfected their aerial mastery during this time of endless summer. It was also when flowering plants appeared and rewrote the rules of terrestrial ecosystems. The first flowers bloomed in a world that had known only the green of ferns and conifers for hundreds of millions of years. With them came colors, fragrances, and partnerships with insects that would reshape every landscape on Earth. Bees evolved alongside blossoms, beetles discovered nectar, and butterflies painted their wings with patterns that matched the petals they visited. Yet, for all its wonders, the Mesozoic was not a single unchanging paradise. It was an era of constant transformation, where volcanic eruptions could alter climate for millions of years, where rising and falling sea levels redrew coastlines across entire continents, and where evolution worked at a pace that generated new species faster than they could spread across the still drifting land masses. The 3 periods of the Mesozoic each had their own character, their own dominant life forms, their own climatic patterns. The Triassic was a world of recovery and experimentation, where survivors of the great Permian extinction tentatively explored new ways of being. The Jurassic was the golden age of giants, when dinosaurs achieved their most spectacular forms and when the climate reached a peak of warmth and stability. The Cretaceous was the age of flowering, when angiosperms revolutionized plant life and when dinosaurs diversified into forms as different as hummingbirds and blue whales. But running through all three periods was a thread of impermanence. The Mesozoic world was built on shifting foundations. Pangaea was breaking apart throughout this time, its fragments drifting toward their modern positions like pieces of a vast, slow-motion puzzle. This continental drift was not merely geological theatre, it was the engine that drove evolution, creating new ocean basins, isolating populations, and generating the geographic barriers that forced life to diversify in ways it never had before. As the supercontinent fractured, new mountain ranges rose, where plates collided. The Rocky Mountains, the Andes, the Alps, all began their slow rise during this era. Volcanic activity was constant, sometimes catastrophic. The mid-Atlantic ridge spread wider with each passing millennium, while the Pacific Ring of Fire blazed with eruptions that could be seen from space, had there been anyone to observe them. And through it all, life persisted, adapted, and flourished. The Mesozoic was not just an age of giants, it was an age of experimentation on a scale never before seen. Evolution tried every possible solution to the problems of existence. There were armored dinosaurs that looked like living tanks, long-necked sauropods that could browse leaves 40 meters above the ground, and swift predators with sickle-shaped claws designed for precision killing. In the oceans, marine reptiles evolved echolocation millions of years before dolphins developed filter-feeding strategies that preceded baleen whales and grew to sizes that rivaled modern sperm whales. Some learned to fly above the waves on wings stretched over hollow bones, while others burrowed through Mesozoic seafloors with flippers modified for digging. If you could stand in this ancient world, the first thing that would strike you would be the silence where you expect familiar sounds. No bird songs as we know them, for most of the Mesozoic passed before true songbirds evolved. No rustling of grass in the wind, for grasses would not carpet the continents until near the era's end. Instead, you would hear the deep rumble of massive feet on soft earth, the crash of falling trees as sauropods pushed through ancient forests, and the calls of creatures that have no modern equivalent. The air itself would feel different. In some periods, oxygen levels were higher than today, making breathing easier but also making fires burn hotter and spread faster. The atmosphere was often hazed with volcanic ash, tinted with sulfur from massive eruptions, or heavy with moisture from seas that stretched far into the continental interiors. Storm systems could reach scales unknown in our modern world, driven by temperature differences between land and sea that were more extreme than any we experience now. Yet, for all its strangeness, the Mesozoic planted the seeds of the world we know. Every bird that flies today carries genes that first took flight in Mesozoic skies. Every flower that blooms recalls the first angiosperms that added color to ancient landscapes. Even the mammals that would eventually inherit the earth were there, small and secretive, waiting in the shadows of the giants for their moment to emerge. This was the deep middle chapter of Earth's story, the time when our planet found its rhythm after the chaos of its early years, but before the ice ages and mass extinctions that would characterize the Cenozoic. It was an era of abundance, of warmth, of life pushed to the very limits of what physics and chemistry would allow. The Mesozoic ended, as it had begun, with fire and darkness. An asteroid 6 miles across struck the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of 1 billion nuclear weapons, triggering an extinction that would erase the non-avian dinosaurs and clear the stage for mammals. But the 18.6 million years that preceded that impact were perhaps the most creative and abundant period in the history of complex life on Earth. To step into the Mesozoic would be to witness our planet at its most alien and most alive, a world where the impossible was routine and where life wrote its most ambitious chapters in stone and bone, and the genetic memory of every living thing that calls Earth home today. This is the story of that ancient world, told in the voice of stone and fossil, wind and time. The Mesozoic did not begin with fanfare. It emerged from silence, from the ashes of the greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life. When the Triassic period opened 252 million years ago, Earth was a wounded planet, still recovering from the Permian-Triassic extinction that had erased 96% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial life. The supercontinent Pangaea stretched from pole to pole, its vast interior baking under skies that had seen too much death. its coasts lapped by oceans that had turned acidic and oxygen poor. This was not the vibrant world the Mesozoic would become. It was a planet in intensive care, where the few survivors of the Great Dying clung to existence in scattered refugia, slowly, cautiously beginning the long work of rebuilding the web of life. The forests that had once covered much of Pangaea were reduced to struggling patches of conifers and seed ferns. The rivers ran through landscapes, emptied of the great synapsids that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for millions of years. Even the insects, those masters of survival, had suffered their only known mass extinction. Yet from this desolation would emerge the most spectacular radiation of life forms our planet had ever seen. The emptiness left by extinction was not a void, but an opportunity. A vast series of ecological niches waiting to be filled by whatever could adapt quickly enough to claim them. The Triassic world was harsh, but pregnant with possibility, and the creatures that survived the Great Dying were about to write the opening chapter of the most dramatic period in Earth's biological history. The geography of this early Mesozoic world was both simpler and more extreme than what we see today. Pangaea was still largely intact, though the first hairline cracks were beginning to appear along what would one day become the Atlantic Ocean. The supercontinent's immense bulk created a climate of devastating extremes. The interior regions, thousands of kilometers from any moderating ocean influence, sweltered under temperatures that could exceed 50 degrees in summer and plummet below freezing in winter. These continental heartlands were vast deserts, their red sandstone formations still visible today as testimony to the aridity that gripped much of the Triassic world. Along the coasts, conditions were more hospitable but far from comfortable. Seasonal monsoons brought torrential rains that could last for months, followed by equally prolonged dry seasons that turned rivers into chains of isolated pools. The Tethys Sea, a massive embayment that separated the northern and southern portions of Pangaea, provided some climatic relief, its warm waters moderating temperatures along its shores and generating the moisture that sustained the period's scattered forests. It was in this harsh landscape that the survivors began their slow expansion. Among them were the archosaurs, a group of reptiles that would eventually give rise to both dinosaurs and crocodilians. In the early Triassic, they were modest creatures, most no larger than modern lizards, but they possessed key adaptations that would serve them well in the challenges ahead. Their more efficient gait, with limbs positioned more directly beneath their bodies rather than sprawled to the sides like their predecessors, gave them an advantage in the energy-demanding environment of Triassic Earth. The tharopsids, the synapsids that had dominated the Permian world, were not yet extinct, but their golden age was ending. Some, like the cynodonts, continued to evolve toward ever more mammal-like characteristics, developing better temperature regulation, more sophisticated teeth, and possibly even the first primitive hair. These survivors would eventually give rise to the first true mammals, but for now they remained secondary players in ecosystems increasingly dominated by archosaur reptiles. In the oceans, recovery was even slower. The marine ecosystems of the early Triassic were impoverished, dominated by simple organisms that could tolerate the low oxygen conditions that lingered from the great extinction brachiopods. Those ancient filter feeders that had ruled Paleozoic seas never fully recovered their former abundance. Their ecological roles were gradually taken over by bivalves, gastropods, and other mollusks that proved more adaptable to the changing ocean chemistry. But even in these depleted seas, innovation was beginning. The first ichthyosaurs appeared during the Triassic, marine reptiles that had returned to the water and were developing the dolphin-like forms that would make them the apex predators of Mesozoic oceans. Their evolution was remarkably rapid, driven by the ecological opportunities presented by seas that were slowly regaining their biological richness. The plant life of the Triassic world bore little resemblance to modern vegetation. There were no flowers, no grasses, no deciduous trees with broad leaves that changed color with the seasons. Instead, the landscape was dominated by gymnosperms, conifers, cycads, and ginkgos that had survived the Permian extinction and were now beginning to diversify into new forms. These plants created forests that were monotonously green, broken only by the occasional brown of dead fronds or the grey-green of lichen-covered rocks. Yet even this seemingly barren world supported complex ecosystems. In the undergrowth, small reptiles and early mammals foraged for insects and seeds, Primitive flies and beetles pollinated cycad flowers, beginning the co-evolutionary relationships that would later explode into complexity with the advent of flowering plants. Streams and lakes supported communities of amphibians, fish, and the first aquatic reptiles, while the skies saw the earliest experiments in powered flight as small pterosaurs took to the air on membranous wings. The Triassic was a world in transition, its climate gradually warming as atmospheric carbon dioxide levels rose from massive volcanic eruptions. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, was building toward its climactic eruption at the period's end. These eruptions would trigger another mass extinction, clearing the ecological stage for the rise of the dinosaurs, but throughout most of the Triassic, they provided a steady pulse of gases that warmed the planet and began the transformation toward the greenhouse conditions that would characterize the rest of the Mesozoic. As temperatures rose and rainfall patterns shifted, the great interior deserts of Pangaea began to shrink slightly, allowing forests to expand into regions that had been barren for millions of years. Rivers flowed year-round through areas that had known only seasonal streams, and lakes began to dot landscapes that had been dry since the Permian extinction. Life was beginning to heal the wounds left by the Great Dying, slowly but inexorably reclaiming the emptiness that had defined the early Triassic world. The animals of this recovering world were still small by later Mesozoic standards, but they were diverse and increasingly specialized. Early dinosaurs like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus appeared in the fossil record, modest creatures that gave little hint of the giants their descendants would become. They shared their ecosystems with a bewildering variety of other archosaurs, armadatosaurs that looked like crocodilian tanks, swift-running ornithosochids, and the massive predatory rhesusochids that were the dominant carnivores of their time. Competition was fierce among these various reptilian lineages. The late Triassic world was a testing ground where different evolutionary solutions to the problems of terrestrial life competed for supremacy. Some groups invested in armor, others in size, still others in speed or metabolic efficiency. The dinosaurs' ultimate success was not yet assured. They were simply one lineage among many, distinguished mainly by certain innovations in hip structure and limb posture that gave them slight advantages in an intensely competitive world. In the marine realm, the recovery from the Permian extinction was generating its own evolutionary experiments. The first plesiosaurs appeared, long-necked marine reptiles that would later evolve into some of the most successful predators in Mesozoic seas. Early marine crocodilians developed flippers and shark-like tails, becoming fully aquatic predators that ruled shallow coastal waters. Even more remarkably, some archosaurs were experimenting with flight. The first pterosaurs took to Triassic skies, their hollow bones and membranous wings representing one of evolution's most successful solutions to the challenge of powered flight. The Triassic world was harsh, competitive, and dangerous, but it was also creative on a scale that our modern Earth can barely match. With so many ecological niches left vacant by the Permian extinction, evolution was free to experiment with forms and lifestyles that would be impossible in more saturated ecosystems. The result was a bestiary of creatures that seem almost mythological. Armor-plated herbivores the size of small trucks, crocodilian predators with legs positioned like those of mammals, and flying reptiles with wingspans that rivaled modern eagles. As the period progressed and climates continued to warm, the stage was being set for even more dramatic changes. The first flowers would soon bloom on Earth, revolutionizing plant life. The dinosaurs were beginning to show hints of the gigantism that would define the Jurassic, and in the oceans, marine reptiles were diversifying into forms that would challenge modern whales for the title of largest animals ever to live on Earth. The Triassic was the Mesozoic's quiet opening movement, a time of recovery and preparation that would set the stage for the symphony of life that was to follow. It was a world that modern eyes would find alien and forbidding, but it was also the crucible in which the next 50 million years of Earth's history were forged. Every step taken by an early dinosaur across Triassic mudflats, every wing beat of a primitive pterosaur through Triassic skies, was part of the foundation upon which the Age of Reptiles would build its greatest achievements. By the end of the Triassic, Earth was becoming a different planet. The volcanic catastrophe that marked the transition to the Jurassic period 20 million years ago eliminated many of the competitors that had kept dinosaurs in check. And as the ash settled from the central Atlantic magmatic province's massive eruptions, a new world began to take shape. This was the beginning of the Jurassic, the middle act of the Mesozoic drama, and it would prove to be one of the most remarkable periods in Earth's history. The planet that emerged from the end Triassic extinction was fundamentally transformed. Sea levels were rising as polar ice melted away entirely, creating vast shallow seas that flooded the continental interiors. Pangaea was breaking apart with increasing speed, the Atlantic Ocean widening as North America and Europe drifted slowly away from each other. These changing geography created new climate patterns, more stable and consistently warm than anything the Triassic had known. This was the beginning of Earth's most successful experiment with greenhouse conditions. Atmospheric carbon dioxide levels soared to 3 or 4 times modern concentrations, trapping heat and creating a world without ice caps, without significant temperature gradients between equator and poles, and without the harsh seasonal extremes that had characterized earlier periods. Palm trees and cycads grew within the Arctic Circle, while the tropics extended far beyond their modern boundaries. It was a world where winter was a mild season rather than a killing frost, where vast areas of the planet enjoyed climates similar to modern Florida or southern California. The dinosaurs stepped into this warming world as the undisputed rulers of terrestrial ecosystems. The large predatory archosaurs that had dominated Triassic food webs were gone, victims of the end Triassic extinction, and dinosaurs rapidly diversified to fill the vacant ecological roles. This was when they began their famous experiments with size, driven by the abundant plant life that flourished under the greenhouse conditions. The first truly gigantic dinosaurs appeared during the early Jurassic. Dilophosaurus, with its distinctive twin crests, reached lengths of 7 meters and foreshadowed the massive predators that would follow. But it was among the herbivorous dinosaurs that gigantism truly took hold. The prosauropods, precursors to the giant sauropods, were already pushing the boundaries of terrestrial animal size, some reaching lengths of 10 meters or more. But size was only part of the story. The Jurassic world was becoming more complex, more interconnected, and more stable than any ecosystem Earth had previously supported. The forests were changing too, as conifers diversified into forms that would remain familiar today. Araucarian conifers, relatives of the modern monkey puzzle tree, created the first truly tall forests, their canopies reaching heights of 60 meters or more. Beneath them, an understory of cycads, ferns and early conifers created multi-layered ecosystems that could support far more diverse communities of animals than the simpler Triassic forests had managed. In these expanding forests, the first true giants were taking shape. The sauropods, those long-necked titans that would become the most iconic dinosaurs of the Jurassic, were evolving from their prosauropod ancestors. Even the early forms like Cetiosaurus were impressive creatures, reaching lengths of 15 meters and weights measured in tons. But they were merely the first notes in what would become a symphony of gigantism, as natural selection drove some lineages towards sizes that challenged the very limits of what terrestrial vertebrates could achieve. The warming climate and rising sea levels were creating new habitats faster than evolution could fill them. Shallow seas invaded the continental interiors, creating vast lagoons and inland waterways that stretched across what are now the American Midwest, the European plain and Central Asia. These marine environments quickly became home to a spectacular array of life forms that existed nowhere else in Earth's history. Marine reptiles were evolving at breakneck speed, adapting to the new opportunities presented by expanded ocean habitats. The ichthyosaurs, those dolphin-like reptiles that had first appeared in the Triassic, were diversifying into forms that ranged from swift pursuit predators to massive deep-diving giants. Some, like Temnodontosaurus, reached lengths of 12 meters and had eyes the size of dinner plates, adaptations for hunting in the deep waters of Jurassic seas. The plesiosaurs were equally impressive, developing into 2 distinct body plans that would persist for the rest of the Mesozoic. The long-necked forms, with their small heads and serpentine necks, were becoming specialists at catching fish and small marine animals in shallow waters. The short-necked varieties or plesiosaurs were evolving into some of the most formidable predators ever to swim in Earth's oceans, with heads as large as automobiles and teeth that could crunch through the armor of their ichthyosaur prey. But perhaps most remarkably, some marine reptiles were experimenting with filter feeding, Millions of years before baleen whales would try the same strategy, large ichthyosaurs with tiny teeth were probably straining plankton from Jurassic seas, while some plesiosaurs developed specialized feeding apparatus for processing small organisms. These experiments in marine ecology were possible only because of the extraordinary productivity of Jurassic oceans, which teemed with ammonites, belemnites, and other invertebrates in concentrations that have rarely been matched since. On land, the warming climate was driving its own innovations. Pterosaurs were diversifying rapidly, their membranous wings carrying them across Jurassic skies in forms that ranged from tiny insect catchers to soaring giants with wingspans that rivaled small aircraft. The Jurassic pterosaurs were perfecting the art of powered flight, developing sophisticated air-sensing abilities and control surfaces that made them far more efficient flyers than their Triassic ancestors. Even more significantly, feathers were appearing for the first time in Earth's history. The first feathered dinosaurs evolved during the Jurassic, initially as insulation against the cool nights that could still occur even in the greenhouse world. But these simple filaments would eventually be co-opted for display, and finally for flight itself. The evolution of feathers represents one of the most important innovations in the history of life, ultimately leading to the most diverse and successful group of vertebrates on the planet today. The forests themselves were becoming more complex and productive than any terrestrial ecosystems in Earth's previous history. The combination of high atmospheric carbon dioxide, warm temperatures, and abundant moisture created conditions that favored rapid plant growth and high productivity. Jurassic forests may have been the most carbon-rich terrestrial ecosystems ever to exist, storing vast amounts of atmospheric carbon in their wood and supporting animal communities of unprecedented biomass. These productive ecosystems could support the massive herbivorous dinosaurs that were becoming increasingly common. The Middle Jurassic saw the appearance of truly gigantic sauropods like Mamenchisaurus, with necks so long they could browse vegetation 17 meters above the ground, and Barosaurus, whose tail alone was longer than most modern buildings are tall. These animals were living excavators, constantly modifying their environments by knocking down trees, creating clearings, and depositing vast quantities of fertilizer that enriched soils and promoted plant growth. The predators evolved to match their prey. Allosaurus, the dominant carnivore of the late Jurassic, reached lengths of 12 meters and possessed a skull full of razor-sharp teeth, designed for slicing through tough dinosaur hide. But even Allosaurus was dwarfed by some of its contemporaries. Fragmentary remains suggest that some Jurassic predators may have reached sizes that wouldn't be exceeded until the Cretaceous period. The Jurassic world was also becoming more geographically complex. As Pangaea continued its breakup, the expanding Atlantic Ocean was creating new climatic patterns, while the separation of Laurasia and Gondwana was beginning to isolate different populations of dinosaurs and drive their evolution in different directions. This geographic isolation would ultimately lead to the extraordinary diversity of dinosaur faunas that characterized the later Mesozoic, as similar ecological niches were filled by different lineages on different continents. Yet despite this increasing geographic complexity, the Jurassic world maintained a remarkable climatic stability. The greenhouse conditions persisted for over 50 million years, with relatively little variation, creating what may have been the most consistently habitable period in Earth's history. There were no ice ages, no major volcanic catastrophes, no asteroid impacts to disrupt the steady warming that characterized the period. This stability allowed evolution to explore possibilities that would be impossible in more variable climates, leading to the extraordinary experiments in size and form that made the Jurassic the golden age of dinosaurs. The oceans of the Jurassic period were equally stable and productive. The warm, shallow seas that covered much of Europe, Asia, and North America during this time created vast reef systems that were home to an incredible diversity of marine life. These reefs were built not by corals as modern reefs are, but by rudists, strange bivalves that formed towering colonial structures. Around these reefs swarmed ammonites in bewildering variety, their spiral shells ranging from tiny buttons to massive forms over 2 meters in diameter. As the Jurassic period progressed toward its close, the stage was being set for even more dramatic changes. The first flowering plants were appearing, though they remained rare and primitive compared to their Cretaceous descendants. The first birds were taking wing, evolved from small theropod dinosaurs and representing the beginning of what would eventually become the most diverse class of terrestrial vertebrates. And in the oceans, marine reptiles were reaching sizes and degrees of specialization that would never be exceeded. The Jurassic world was a planet at the peak of its greenhouse experiment, a time when Earth's climate machine had found a stable configuration that supported more life, and more diverse life, than any previous or subsequent period. It was a world where giants walked among giants, where the skies were filled with flying reptiles, and where the seas teemed with predators that could swallow modern great white sharks whole. It was the high noon of the Mesozoic, a golden age of reptilian dominance that set the stage for the even more spectacular evolutionary innovations that would characterize the Cretaceous period to come. It may have begun almost shyly, not with thundering feet, but with a longer reach toward green light. A neck adding one more vertebra, lungs taking in air in a new, more efficient way, bones growing fast and hollowed by quiet scaffolds of air. Somewhere on a Jurassic plain, perhaps after summer rain had cleared the dust and made the resin smell rise from conifer bark, a herd of long-necked herbivores lifted their heads and looked over forests that had grown taller than memory. The ground was soft with needles, the sky was warm with insects, and something in their bodies, an arrangement of lavers and bellows and patient growth, was moving them toward enormity. We call them sauropods, and the name now carries weight, the way a hill carries shadow. But the story of how they grew so large might be softer than the name suggests, more like a series of small permissions granted by climate, by plants, by air, by the very design of their bones. Permission to keep growing, because nothing forced them to stop. Permission to stretch, because the canopy always seemed a little further away. Permission to move slowly, because the world for a long spell allowed slowness. Imagine the biomechanics, not as a blueprint, but as a lullaby whispered through the skeleton. The neck, composed of a procession of elongated vertebrae, wasn't a simple pole. It was a living bridge, with air chambers threaded through the bone, lightening the span. Air sacs, perhaps much like those of modern birds, could have poured oxygen into a body the size of a small house without burdening it with heavy lungs alone. Each breath may have been a tide flowing through a system that kept fresh air in circulation, even as the animal paused to chew, or more likely, to pluck and swallow without chewing at all, because chewing was not their way. Teeth shaped like pencils or spoons suggest a grab-and-go cuisine. The real work happened inside, in warm, fermenting darkness, where plant fibers softened and surrendered their calories slowly. In a world of conifers and cycads, of ginkgo fronds and horsetails, where leaf protein might have been modest and lignin stubborn, a big gut could have been a kind of wisdom. The bigger the stomach and the longer the digestive corridor, the more time for microbes to whisper nutrients free, and so size might have been a digestive strategy before it was a spectacle. Growth would have felt like weather passing, a season that never quite ended. Some bone slices, fossilized and thin enough to pass light, hint at fast growth rings, at an adolescence that rushed toward mass, the way rivers hurry toward a sea. Perhaps they remained half-grown for years, still able to outrun dangers, and then crossed invisible thresholds where speed no longer protected them, and size did, an arm's-length bargain with the predators of their day. Juveniles in the brush and bracken, subadults on the margin, adults towering in the open, standing like movable trees. Listen for their feet, not the drumroll of cinema, but a deep, measured hush. Many sauropods likely spread their weight broadly, cushioned by pads that turned heavy steps into a muted rhythm. Trackways, preserved by chance and time, suggest gaits that were steady and almost tender, as if the earth and the animal had agreed to share the burden of contact. 4-beat patterns, parallel paths that keep pace as if in quiet procession. There is something reassuring in those parallel lines, evidence perhaps of herds moving together, not frantic, not scattered, but coordinated by habit and memory. Where there are herds, there are rituals. We can only guess at them, gently. Perhaps dawn gatherings, at safe clearings. Perhaps the old ones remembered routes to mineral licks or seasonal floodplains, where horsetails grew dense and sweet. Perhaps mothers returned, year after year, to sandy bars warmed by the long sun, scratching shallow bowls and laying small eggs by the dozen. So small for such giants that one might feel a flicker of surprise. Small eggs could have been a strategy too. Many chances rather than a few. Many little lives entrusted to heat and time. Some hatching into a world already mapped by the low-beating thunder of distant feet. Predators would have watched the edges, the big-jawed hunters of the late Jurassic, cautious around the pillars of the adults, but attentive to the margins where a misstep could separate a youngster from the living wall. The arms race, if we can call it that, might have been less about speed and more about positioning, about patience, about the economy of risk. A swipe of a tail, imagine it now like a flagellum of muscle, a whip of tendon and air that could crack with the sound of split wind. One lash at dusk might have been enough to teach a lesson that lasted a lifetime. The world that nourished this scale was generous in other ways. Carbon dioxide was high, warmth widespread, winters softened to long dusks rather than cruel nights. Plants grew fast in many regions, adding layers of needles and cones and new tips reachable by a neck that could sway across 2 stories of living green. If the leaves were poor in nitrogen, the abundance of leaves may have compensated, quantity answering where quality felt thin, and the very act of eating, hours and hours of reaching, nipping, swallowing may have shaped landscapes, opening light wells in the canopy, turning forests porous, inviting understories to flourish, then bringing the herd back for the tender regrowth. We might picture sauropods as engineers, not by intention but by presence. Their paths could have become seasonal roads. Their dung, deposited in gifts as large as boulders, would have fed insects, seeded plants, and built soils that held water a little longer after rain. The herd could have been a moving festival of microbes and seeds and tiny hitchhikers, beetles in the crusts, spores catching rides, future forests carried through present ones. The giants, in this view, were not merely animals within an ecosystem. They were weather systems with legs, redistributing fertility as clouds redistribute rain. How did the necks not collapse? We wonder late at night, when the body is heavy and the pillow is kind. Physics whispers that balance matters, and sauropod bodies might have been tuned as a counterpoise, long tails behind, long necks, hips a fulcrum ligament stretched like quiet cables along the spine, air spaces inside the bones. Again and again this gentle trick, lightening the load without sacrificing strength. The muscles would have worked not to lift each moment from nothing, but to adjust a system already floating in equilibrium. It seems plausible that most postures were efficient ones, and that dramatic movements, rearing, sudden swings, were rare, saved for danger or for the slow theatre of courtship. Courtship. It's tempting to embroider, maybe colour washed along the throat sacs in spring, maybe scent glands painted bark, where rivals would smell them. Maybe they simply stood nearer, necks parallel for long minutes at dawn, a rhythm of breath mixing in the cool air above fern beds. It might not take much, in a world so full, to say yes. As the Jurassic lengthened, there were many kinds. Some lineages pushed the neck into improbable geographies, a horizon-seeking instrument that could browse over a patchwork of heights without moving the torso much at all. Others kept necks shorter but bodies stout, anchored against predators by mass itself. In some valleys the giants wore hides studded with osteoderms, tiny islands of bones set in the skin, sun-warmed perhaps, or simply another layer of defense. In uplands where vegetation was sparse, bodies might have trended leaner on floodplains rich with horsetails and soft rushes. Bellies could have rounded like moons. Water drew them, not merely to drink, but to cool. Midday heat in a greenhouse world can settle like a shawl over shoulders and stay. A river's edge might have offered relief, legs half submerged, tails trailing in green water, while dragonflies stitched blue light above the surface, calves asleep on sandbars, heads tucked along flanks, a whisper of breeze ruffling the tips of ginkgo leaves, the distant rumble of thunder through high clouds that never seemed to hurry, and then fire. Not catastrophe necessarily, but a regular participant. Warm, oxygen-rich air may have encouraged flames to travel where lightning pointed. Needled forests can burn with a dry, musical hiss, leaving black lines on trunks and opening the forest floor to sun. Fire in such landscapes might have been part of the pulse: burn, sprout, graze, move, creating mosaics of age and height. that suited long-necked foragers perfectly. In the ash after, new green is soft and nutrient-rich. You can almost smell it, that sharp sweetness plants carry when they begin again. We sometimes speak of limits, the physics that hem life in, blood pressure to raise a head, heat to shed, legs to bear a city's weight. Perhaps the giants solved these not with singular genius but with a chorus of small answers, hearts enlarged, yes, or else clever roting of vessels, carotid sinuses, maybe that buffered sudden changes when heads dipped to drink. Heat might have fled through vast surfaces earlier at dawn, later at dusk, while midday found them still and shaded. The legs, 4 columns, not pillars of stone, but living, flexing columns, supported by cartilage, tendons, pads, and speed, relinquished in exchange for certainty. In their certainty, a kind of grace. At night the world would have cooled. Stars mirrored in oxbow lakes. The smells changed. Spice of conifer sap, peat, the faint mineral of damp stone, insects tangled the air with a soft trilling. Perhaps the giants lay down. Perhaps they stayed standing, dozing in shifts the way some modern giants do. The herd held its shape in the dark. If one stirred, others listened. A tail thumped once, twice, reassuringly. Breath steamed like small clouds, then vanished. In the morning fog, bodies appeared as islands in it, then as continents. Light went silver along necks, then gold. Feet found old paths. The day opened into hours of reaching and swallowing and walking and pausing. A slow choreography repeated across continents, in different places, different names, though we do not speak them here. Different patterns of vertebrae, different arrangements of spines and hips and skulls, all answering the same irresistible invitation: grow and keep growing. Because this world, for now, allows it. If a storm lingered for days, the herd might have sheltered along a ridge, turning their broad backs to the rain, letting rivers write new letters in the sand below. If the air went dry for a season, they might have followed green north, then returned as the monsoon came back, like a remembered song. The map was not fixed, but their traditions perhaps were. Calving grounds revisited, salt flats mined with gentle toes, old trees leaned upon until they yielded and opened a patch of sun. Their story threads through stone now, footprints hardened to pages, bone turned to mineral, nests preserved like bowls in forgotten kitchens. Each record is a whisper, and the whispers overlap, just enough to sound like music. We hear the theme, but not the full arrangement. Still, something steady emerges. That size can be a refuge, that slowness can be a strategy, that in a warm and generous world, life sometimes takes the space it is offered and fills it with visible breath. Of course, the experiment was not without costs. A body so large is a commitment. If drought clenched a whole region for too long, if a disease rippled through a particular plant, if a migration corridor closed, the margin for such bulk could thin. Predators, ever adaptive, learned the shapes of opportunity. The giants survived by numbers and by habit, and by the simple calculus of their mass. But the ledger was never entirely favorable. It was just for a long time balanced. When we step back further than the size, back into the texture of their days, we may feel something like calm. These creatures drawn as monsters in our quick stories might have lived mostly unhurried lives, lives made of repetition and weather, of tastes and roots and remembered shade. The rise of giants, then, is not only a spectacle of scale, it is also an ode to patience, to the way an era can cradle a lineage, and a lineage can gently sculpt an era in return. The herd moves again now, receding into their morning, vertebrae counting the distance in quiet increments. The ground keeps their secrets. The air, warm and slightly resinous, holds their shape for a moment longer, and then lets it go. Slip beneath the surface, and the Mesozoic changes temperature, color, sound. The noise of feet fades. The resin-sweet air is replaced by salt, by a hush woven from billions of small motions. Light breaks into ladders, descending only so far. Below that, cooler greens, then night. Here, the age of reptiles is liquid. Imagine a warm interior seaway in what would one day be Europe. Islands like commas, sandbars rearranged by every storm. The water is shallow enough for sun to paint the floor, yet connected to open ocean through channels that breathe tides in and out like lungs. In these inland basins and in true oceans beyond, reptiles return to an element their ancestors had left behind, and in returning, they learned new ways to move, to sense, to live. An ichthyosaur passes, not so much swimming as writing a sentence in water. The body is tuned to speed, a crescent tail sculling in clean beats, a dorsal fin that stabilizes without a thought, flippers held steady like small kites. The skull is long, jaws needled with teeth adapted for slippery prey, but it's the eyes that stop you wide as plates, ringed by bony supports that may have braced them against pressure. Built to gather what little light sinks below the surface, the gaze is enormous, solemn, perhaps bright with reflections, anchovy flashes, moonlines trembling in surge, perhaps, in deeper dives, open to a darkness that folds around the swimmer like velvet. Breath is the only tether to the sky now. Every hunt is measured between surfacings, between quick gulps of air taken among glittering waves. We picture them rising in pairs, perhaps herds, their backs briefly inked by sunlight, a soft whistle of exhalation, then the tilt and gone. The sea closes, bubbles argue themselves to nothing. In the space of a minute the surface forgets them, the way wind forgets a hill. This return to the water came with new bargains. The body reshaped around a central question: how to make fluid do your will. Ichthyosaurs answered with tail power and efficiency, with spines that turned to springs and muscles that stored and released energy in clean pulses. Plesiosaurs and their short-skulled cousins, the plesiosaurs, chose another path: four-flippered flight, a choreography more like the underwater glide of penguins or sea turtles, forelimbs and hind limbs writing figure eights through the water, lift generated with every stroke. Watching them in the mind's quiet tank, you sense poise rather than sprint, a capacity to hover among fish schools, to pivot and surge, to circle prey with the patience of slow thunderheads. Two archetypes, long-necked and short, share the same sea. The long-necked forms carry small heads at the end of astonishing reach, a serpentine periscope that threads through shoals, picking individuals from the collective shimmer. Their teeth are finer, their bite more about grip than crush. You can almost feel the water turn silkier around that neck, eddies gentled by streamlined scales and the logic of minimal disturbance. The short-necked pliosaurs, they are different weather. Broad skulls, like living battering rams, jaws that might close with the finality of doors in a storm. Their flippers beat with muscular conviction. When they accelerate, it is sudden and whole-bodied, the sea itself seeming to lurch around them. We do not have to be certain to imagine this. The fossils whisper enough, massive attachment sites for muscle, teeth ridged for cutting. Skulls buttressed as though impact were ordinary. Between these hunters move crowds, fish with armored scales that sound, in the imagination, like rain on tin, ray-finned lineages, recognizable by the angle of their fins. Sharks that have already resolved themselves into the graceful solution we know today. Ammonites drift and turn like living commas, their buoyancy managed by chambers they flood and empty, their tentacles tasting the water, their shells glinting with what might have been mother of pearl under certain angles of light. Belemnites, squid with internal bullets of calcite pulse through the shallows, leaving ink ghosts that spread and disappear as if the sea were erasing a thought mid-sentence. The reef. The reef is its own city. In some times and places, corals and sponges grow together into ridges that fold the light into lace. Harbours for small lives, barricades against waves. In later ages, bivalve architects will join and sometimes dominate, building thickets of shell that stand like towers in the warm, quiet sea. For now, picture terraces, buttresses, squares of shade where shoals breathe and pulse. Every opening is a door, every overhang a shelter where eyes watch. Some patient, some afraid, some simply considering the day. Senses attuned for a world of pressure and pulse. Sound travels faster in water, distances collapse. A pliosaur might feel the panic of a fishbowl long before it sees it. A rumor of vibration that suggests entity moving in fear. An ichthyosaur might scan with big eyes and then close them for a beat in darkness that is not sightless, but textured with current temperature gradients, the taste of river water in the mouth, the faint mineral of distant rain. Navigation is not by landmarks but by gradients, by memory of where the seabed rises and falls, by past storms that rearranged sand, by channels that hold cooler water like blue veins in a green arm. Life, even at sea, has its shorelines. Tides comb beaches, dragging broken shells that tick together with a noise like whispered glass. Eggs of reptiles are absent from these sands. These are not the old amphibian days of hauling and digging. Evidence suggests that some marine reptiles gave birth in the water itself, tail first the way whales do now, calves emerging into suspension, the first breath taken when the mother nudges them up into sun and salt spray. Others may have tried alternate strategies, but the drift of the story hints at live birth as a common answer to the problems of distance. What does infancy look like in this ocean? Perhaps a mother pacing her calf in slow arcs just below the skin of the sea, flippers adjusting angle by degrees, the pair rising every few minutes to breathe together. Perhaps the little one learns the shape of the world in loops, reef edges, sand tongues, the endless horizon of the open shelf. Predators test the perimeter, the mother tests them back, presenting her bulk, flashing a skull full of warning. Then, with time, the calf is simply there beside her less often, and then not at all, gone into the same wide arithmetic that holds everything here. Storms. The word sits heavy on the water. When a cyclone turns across a Cretaceous Gulf or a Jurassic inland sea, the sky becomes weight and movement. Waves steepen, the white torn off their backs and thrown like froth flowers into the air. Near shore, the fingers of the reef break the surf into rows of exploding glass. In the channels, currents pack and accelerate. Those who cannot dive must shelter. Those who can drop. Beneath a certain depth, the water remembers only long, slow heaves, the chaos above thinned to a regular sway. Perhaps the reptiles, with lungs filled and hearts slowed, drifted there among suspended particles, shell dust, broken algae, the fine chalk that the sea is forever making and unmaking, waiting for the sky's argument to run out of words. And then, after everything is rearranged, sandbars move, seagrass patches step 3 paces to the south. The smell of land, washed into the sea by swollen rivers, changes the taste of the water for days, with the pulse of new nutrients. Plankton bloom, green fog in sunlight, little suns multiplying in the bodies of tiny plants. The sea responds, filter feeders open lacework arms, fish join in schools that swell and twist like ideas, predators settle into the edges, new lines drawn, the pages clean, the pen moves. Deep time carries its own seasons, not just storms and calms, but intervals when oxygen in deeper basins thins, when warm surface layers seal off the sea like a lid, and the black mud below goes anoxic and quiet. In such years, the best living moves upward, toward the light, the action pressed into the topmost story of the water column. Resilient as they are, the reptiles must track these invisible shifts, perhaps ranging farther, perhaps resting more. We, reading the sediments millions of years later, find dark bands laid down by plankton that died and fell without meeting decay, a script in shadow hinting at seas that breathed differently, for a spell and then eventually cleared their throats and went on. Night arrives swiftly at sea, the surface changes from glitter to ink, the wind slackens, or else it sharpens. Either way the mood changes. Some hunters may have risen then, taking advantage of silhouettes against starfields. Others, big-eyed ones, might have slipped deeper, where bioluminescent dots light the ceiling of water with slow constellations. The reef crackles with life you hear more than see, a low continuous static made by countless jaws and legs working, a soft electricity threaded through coral streets, and always the need to breathe. This simple insistence stitches water to sky. It means a mother cannot stay by her newborn forever without rising. It means a hunter must break cover at intervals that prey can learn. It means that moonlight matters. It means that a swell, even a small one, can complicate the moment of air. It means that far-off lightning can be smelled sooner on the surface than felt below, and that a slick calm at dawn feels as generous as a meadow unfenced. Perhaps it also means memory. Not the fossilized kind, but the living one. Roots remembered along shelf edges. The exact distance between two islands. The taste a bay takes on when a river in flood reaches it. The sound of a reef flat at high tide. A single long shoh that speaks of gaps passable now, impassable later. In this sense, the marine reptiles might have known their world not as a map with lines, but as a song with verses, some repeated, some improvised, all keyed to breath. We wonder about their social lives. Did ichthyosaurs school like dolphins, weaving and turning with exquisite coordination, or did they pass in looser associations, individuals aligned by opportunity more than kinship? Did long-necked plesiosaurs cruise in pairs, parallel, their heads lifting in unison sometimes for reasons that have more to do with comfort than need? Were there migrations, north in the warm half, south, when rains moved, along coastlines that shifted a little every million years, but held their character like a face keeps its look even as it ages? Hunger does not argue. It persuades. Even the most beautiful swimmer must eat. A day in their lives might have been quiet hunts punctuated by sudden clicks of success. A fish caught, a squid held firm, a crustacean wrestled from its shell and swallowed in an arc of neck that looks, from a distance, like a sentence closing. The giant pliosaurs would have hunted larger things. Sometimes we suspect each other. The sea has room for such intensity, and room, immediately after, for silence again. The blood cloud thins. The current peels it away. Sunlight returns to the page and writes something new where the old line ended. On the floor, in the soft anachronistic hush that fine mud makes, a different economy runs. Crinoids lift feathered arms into the current and let food come. Sea urchins test boundaries, burrowers worms. Tiny bivalves make the sediment breathe like dough. The shell settles, home to a hermit that will not be invented for a while yet. Another shell grows around a body that will, in time, mark a date for geologists based on its particular spiral. A quiet stopwatch that counts millions of years with chambers and ridges. If we could press our hands to a Jurassic cliff in the present and feel through it, as if stone were only thickened time, the layers would be alternating phrases of calm chalk and rougher sand, of storm beds and lulls. In some we'd find vertebrae, hollowed arcs that once held a highway of nerves and blood. In others the broad paddles of flippers, each bone a joint in a fin that wrote motion with calligraphy. In a few the outline of a mother and her small one inside. An image so intimate it changes the temperature of the room. The sea keeps such secrets until it doesn't, and when it releases them, they come to us as invitations rather than answers. There are surprises in this water, experiments. Even then, some reptiles lengthen the snout and weaken the teeth, edging toward the strange possibility of straining small prey en masse, a behavior that, much later, mammals will turn into a major way of being. Others thicken their ribs, ballast added for stability, trading sprinting for steadiness on the bottom. A few lineages lean into armor, a hedge against bigger jaws. Marine crocodilians, leaner and more fish-like than their river relatives, cut through the sea like arrows, tails tall and bodies sleek, evidence that evolution does not mind rewriting a story if the setting favors different verbs. And always, sunlight in water, the way it breaks things into fragments and then assembles them again as if to say, yes, this is one world, but it has many surfaces. By late Jurassic days, these seas are at their most familiar to us. Warm, wide-shouldered, generous. The continents continue their slow drift, and each shift redraws the coastlines that dictate where currents meet and what blooms. With every redrawing, new nurseries open and old highways close. The reptiles follow, or vanish, or find a third path we have not imagined. The players change, but the choreography retains its pulse. Rise for air, dive, eat, rest, avoid teeth, breed, rise for air again. Come up with them for a moment, just to feel the connection. At the surface the world is wind and light, and sometimes rain so fine it merges with spray. A head breaks through, scarred perhaps, glossy, eyes adjusting to glare, the breath leaves in a plume, and for an instant you hear it as a human sound. Because breath is a human sound, because breath is an animal sound, because breath is just what life makes when it touches air and the air answers. Then, the tilt, the roll, the body returns to its element. Down where the sea keeps its cool, steady voice, the reptiles write their long story without hurry. Predators become elders and slow, calves become hunters and test their edges. Generations pass measured not in seasons but in migrations, in remembered bays, in reefs that grew and later grew quieter. The ocean is large enough to absorb their comings and goings and still seem calm. We leave them here for a while, in blue-green rooms where time has the thickness of water and the future approaches like a tide you cannot see from where you float. Our path will bring us back to these coasts, inland seas, still to come, chalk yet to fall like snow from a million summers, but for now, the surface smooths. The wake of an ichthyosaur, briefly creased in silver, fades. The reef resumes its small electric murmur. Light climbs one more rung down, then hesitates, and gently gives up. Lift your eyes, and the Mesozoic opens a third country. Not sea, not stone, but sky. A realm thinned by light, stitched with wind, where heat rises in slow columns and the air itself can be ridden like a river. Before birds fully claim it, another lineage writes the first long sentences there. Pterosaurs, reptiles. Yes, but air's own after a time. Discover how to make skin and bone hold the shape of wind. Imagine a shoreline at late morning. The land is still damp, from a night fog that moved in from warm water, leaving a bitter resin smell wherever it touched conifer bark. Small waves flip pebbles in perfect, patient clicks, and along the edge, a scatter of pterosaurs stirs, some the size of crows, some like long-legged storks, and much later some that will span shadows across a village square. They stand not on their bellies but on all fours, hands folded into clever, weight-bearing limbs, the fourth finger extended beyond reason, a living yardarm ready to tension the day. The wing is not a simple sheet. It is architecture, membrane in 3 panels, tensioned between a hand of one vast finger, a shoulder that breathes, and a body tuned to buoyancy. There may be internal fibers, tiny struts that resist stretch and flutter, keeping the surface honest when gusts try to snag it. At the trailing edge, a slender tendon holds the line clean. Between the legs, some carry a second veil of skin, a living tail plane. Around the body, fuzz hair like pinofibers, softening the outline, holding a layer of warm air close, carrying rain in tiny beads that do not soak, but slide. Launch is a decision. Perhaps not a cliff dive, though cliffs help, but a coiled push. All forelimbs and hind limbs unfurling at once. A vault. A spring. For an instant the body is a question mark drawn against bright water, and then the wings catch. The question becomes an answer written in glide. Once airborne the rules change. Weight is no enemy if it's spread. Speed is no enemy if it's planned. The air offers slopes of invisible stone, thermals over darker ground, ridge lifts where onshore wings lean up against rock and must climb, evening glass-offs when the day relaxes and the whole lower sky becomes a soft escalator. The pterosaurs learn these gradients the way river fish learn eddies. They bank, they circle, they surf. Watch them turn, the outside wing stretches and the inside wing softens. The body rolling with the dancer's economy. The head stays level. The world tips. Inland, there are broad flats of heat. Over fern meadows at midday, rising air forms lazy pillars. One could drift there for hours, almost without flapping, climbing in spirals until the air cools and the ground turns to a quilt. River lines in silver conifer crowns like clustered stars. Then a long glide to the next column, the wing whispering, the horizon drawing and redrawing itself with each small correction. At sea, morning wind stacks in even streets, lines of lift running parallel to the coast. The pterosaurs know these too. They follow them like footpaths, turning slightly to stay where the air is thickest with possibility. A long-beaked fisherman dips and snatches flash of head. a tremor in the membrane as weight shifts. Then smooth again, the prey a dark little certainty swallowed mid-arc. Their faces carry stories in bone. Some wear crests the size of sails, some a modest blade, some a curving ornament that may have been all theatre, or partly rudder, or both. Colour, perhaps pigments locked in tiny packets inside the fuzz, suggest shades that might have mattered to mates, to rivals, to the self. In the right light, a crest could have burned orange, or a throat patch could have glowed like embers at dawn. We can imagine this carefully, knowing that the sky has always rewarded signals that travel far. On land, their gait is confident if unusual. Forelimbs strong, hind limbs cooperative. Trackways kept by accident in mud and later hardened to law show footprints in even rhythm. Fingertips turned inward. The step practical, they forage like waders along tidal flats. Long jaws testing shallow pools for fish or shrimp or stranded things. Eyes quick to the smallest shiver. In insect-rich clearings, smaller forms hawk the air like living commas, tracing sentences around each other and eating the punctuation. Hunger writes variety. There are needle-toothed pterosaurs made for fish, and blunt-toothed cousins that may have crushed shells. Some carry beaks that suggest sieving, straining small lives from water's texture. Others look like aerial generalists, catching what moves in sunbeams below the canopy. Those with longer legs might stalk inland like herons. Those with shorter ones keep to the safer line of the surf. Each body is a choice. Longer wings for better carries, shorter for quicker turns, larger heads for bigger prey, smaller for less draft, more membrane for slower speeds, less for faster dives. Night belongs partly to them too. Cooler air settles, and moths, old families of them, lift from the undersides of fronds, and from the tips of horsetails. In the half-light, some pterosaurs may patrol like bats, silhouettes crossing the young stars. Others roost, claws finding purchase in bark, rough with resin blisters. The colony quiets, small squeaks, bodies shifted closer for warmth, a wing unfurled over a neighbour, then folded again with care. Eggs, when they come, are not ceramic but leather, soft-shelled, meant for Earth's embrace, not air. We picture colonies tucked in sheltered flats, just above the high water line, or inland on heated slopes, dozens of shallow scrapes, each cradling future light bones. Incubation may be a partnership between sun and soil and bodies, a shared responsibility in which warmth is borrowed from day and kept through night. The hatchlings, perhaps precocial, perhaps quickly flight-capable, perhaps guarded in creches beneath attentive eyes. We tread gently here. Fossils give tender hints. Behavior could have been a field of variations. Wind has a voice, and they learned it. A crosswind says, crab. A gust says, flex now. A lull says, fall a little, and trust the next street. Over inland ridges where monsoon storms build, pterosaurs might have waited at the edge of rain, taking the first cool outflow like a slow elevator down. Over hot playa lakes, dust devils thread the white with ropey columns. A risky game maybe, but one that could lift a winged body quick, then drop it just as quick with a grin that is not a human thing but feels familiar. And then, feathers enter the story. They begin earlier, as insulation and display on small ground-running predators. But in the long afternoon of the Jurassic, we begin to sense a sentence changing tense, from running to leaping, to something that holds the air. The first birds, if we use the word loosely at first, carry a set of contradictions that make sense only when you see them moving. Teeth still in the mouth, but feathers along the arms, claws on the wing, but primaries asymmetrical, each vein holding more wind on one side than the other, a long bony tail, but fletched, able to fan and trim. In a forest of conifers and cycads, where the understory is lace and shadow and shafts of light, a small feathered animal clambers along a trunk and pauses. The claws grip bark the way old hands grip a familiar railing. Feathers lift and settle in the breeze, down at the base for warmth, pugnacious at the ends for control. One beat, two awkward, earnest, and then the body lifts just enough to clear the next branch. Maybe not high flight, not yet. Maybe a glide tightened by flaps that keep the glide from becoming a fall. The mouth opens, perhaps with a small sound as simple as a breath. The eye checks distances. The landing is not perfect, but the desire is there, and the anatomy is listening. Feathers are miracles of patience. A central shaft, veins assembled from barbs, barbs assembled from barbules. Each microscopic hook clasping the next to weave a surface that can be broken, and then with a pinch and a preen, they began, we suspect, as warmth for small, active bodies in cool nights, then as banners for saying I am this and not that, then as parachutes and fans and brakes, and finally as wings, true and articulate, capable of that particular alchemy where muscle becomes lift. The first flights might have been quiet matters, short and careful, connecting perches the way a child connects stepping stones across a creek. But small advantages accumulate, a jump made safer, a glide made longer, a sprint that ends not at the teeth of a predator, but above them. Over years that stack into millions, the shoulder reshapes, the breastbone grows a keel for stronger muscles, the tail shortens and stiffens into a pygostyle, less whip, more rudder. The hand loses fingers to the cause of becoming a wing. The wishbone, a spring, grows elastic, flexing with each downstroke, storing and releasing energy the way a branch does when you bend and let go. And sense follows form. Light bones with internal struts, strong as bridges are strong. Let bodies stay light for takeoff, but firm for landing. Lungs learn a new kindness. Not just sacs that fill and empty, but a circuit, air passing through in one direction. Fresh oxygen bathing blood even as the rhythm of flight demands much. In this, birds may share a kinship of breath with dinosaurs more broadly, a pattern that makes air inside the body as organized as the air outside. It changes the forest, not the way a fire changes it, not by subtraction, but by addition. Movement appears in a third plane. Predators must look up as well as around. Insects, already masters of air, now meet new company. Color gains a new market. What looks bold on the ground reads differently. At dawn, when a wing opens and catches a shaft of light, flowers still rare at first will later meet pollinators with feathers. Seeds will find carriers that can cross rivers without getting wet. Spores will ride gusts that a flock stirs as it lifts in a surprise wave. What do the days sound like? Perhaps not like modern mornings yet. No layered chorus of complex songs, but there might be calls, whistles, crackles of wing over fern, the dry slide of feathers preened into alignment. The beat of pterosaur membranes is lower, more drum than violin. The beat of early feathers, a crisper thing, a breath that knows its edges. Two architectures share the same medium now. Membrane and feather, tendon and quill. They do not erase each other. The sky is big enough to let both be right. Over surf, pterosaurs angle for lift that suits long spans and slow sinking speeds. Over forest bowls, birds hopscotch between boughs and improvise in tight spaces. A summer storm approaches, both feel its palm press down. The first returns to a ridge and perches with wings tented against spitting rain. The second tucks under a branch, shakes water from its back in a shimmer of droplets that briefly hang in air like beads on strings. Predators follow into the third plane. Small, agile hunters feathered themselves, leap branch to branch with silent feet, gliding when a gap is wider than a jump should be. Their eyes face forward. Depth is a story they tell themselves well. The arms race climbs into the canopy. Better turns, quicker climbs, sudden drops that surprise those below. Safety keeps moving. It is a verb, not a noun. At dusk, the sky lets go of heat. Thermals slacken, ridge, lift softens. The last flights of the day are purposeful. A return to the cliff face, where generations have clung. A short hop to the upper side of a bough, where dawn will find sun first. In the dark, bodies rest, but do not fully forget. A pterosaur's membrane sighs as it relaxes. A bird's feathers settle into each other like hands laced and content. There are failures here too. The kind that become fossils because something sudden said no more. A squall stronger than expected, a landing misjudged, a night too cold. The stone records them without malice, the way a tide pool holds whatever the tide leaves. In those records we read splinters of habit, the angle of a shoulder, the proportions of a wing, the presence of a soft outline that says, yes. Fuzz was there, yes. Feathers were already stitches in the story. By the Cretaceous, air becomes crowded with intention. Pterosaurs reach their largest spans, broad-winged monarchs that may have crossed shallow seas on days when the wind set the table. Birds diversify quietly, a spectrum from forest gliders to stronger flyers, with keels carving their chests. Some keep teeth, some let them go, some climb the night, trading color for stealth, some become day's small sparks, quick and brilliant. Flowers multiplying offer nectar, insects responding become new packets of protein in motion, and yet the sky remains wide, generous. Even the largest shadows are light enough to ride thin thermals that lift in late morning. Even the smallest can find air under fronds, left messy by herbivores who do not know they're making runways. If a prairie fire lays a dark skin over a patch of earth, the next day's sun makes that skin a factory of rising air, and the wings answer, and you can almost hear, if you stand very still and close your eyes, the soft applause of creatures taking the invitation. There will be an ending later, ash and winter, and a long hush. The membranes will vanish. The feathers will falter, and then, astonishingly, many will persist, reshaped by time into the chorus we know. But here, in the middle of the Mesozoic day, look up and see only continuation. Lines drawn and erased and drawn again across blue. Curves that repeat because they are right. Bodies that have learned to trust a medium that cannot be seen, only felt, like faith, like breath. We leave the sky reluctantly, with one last glance at a ridge at sundown. The wind is warm, slanting, steady. A pterosaur steps forward, crouches, springs. The membrane catches. The slope of air is there, invisible and kind. Off to the left, between two tall conifers, a small feathered form skips outward from a branch and opens its hands to light. Two solutions to the same problem draw their separate arcs, then both join the same path home. A thin line of lift that only experience, and patience, and a certain elemental hope can find. In this pre-flower world, sex is solved without petals. Conifers release pollen in clouds, grains so small and so numerous that the sun can appear to float in a faint haze when the wind begins its work. Cycads, more intimate, may host beetles that crawl into cones, seeking heat and shelter, dusting themselves with pollen as they go. Primitive bargains that hint at the entanglements to come when flowers finally reinvent reproduction with color and scent. Ferns cast spores to the air like tiny prayers. They do not ask the wind to go far, only far enough. The forest breathes these invisible offerings, and the day goes on, and somewhere a new plant begins in a place that yesterday held only leaf litter and light. Before petals painted the air with color and perfume, before bees learned a dance to tell each other where sweetness lived, the world's green skin was woven from older threads. Conifers held the horizon like quiet spires, cycads lifted armored crowns, their cones heavy with the memory of deep time. Ginkgo branches spread their fans, each leaf a soft wedge of green light, simple and somehow ceremonial. Ferns and horsetails stitched the understory with lacy persistence. It was not a dull world, only a different one, composed in resins and spores rather than nectars and blooms. A world that thought in shades of evergreen and the brown gold of sun-cured fronds, and yet felt alive in a slow, abundant way that might have soothed even the most restless heart. Walk into such a forest, Jurassic in its prime, air warm and faintly marine, and the first thing you notice is the vertical generosity. Trunks rise straight and patient, the canopy arranged more in plates and layered terraces than in the fluffy crowns we often see today. Araucarian conifers, some with bark like armored scales and branches set in radial whorls, reach 60 meters and more. Their cones sit like carved lanterns, heavy, deliberate. Beneath them, a second story of cycads gathers light, each plant a rosette of stiff, feathered leaves, cupping morning dew. Lower still, ferns spill along edges of shade, fronds unfurling as if time itself were exhaling. Horsetails jointed and geometric, stand in green colonnades along stream margins where the soil stays wet enough to remember last night's rain. The palate is restrained, greens from deep bottle to lime, browns from bark to spore dust. But texture does the work of color, and the eye lingers the way it lingers on an old tapestry. not flashy yet rich. Listen, and the soundscape is different too. There is no insect choir tuned to blossoms yet. Instead you catch the dry whisper of fronds, the brittle click of cone scales, the soft percussion of conifer needles falling in slow patient rain. Beetles rasp at dead wood, millipedes write their quiet cursive through damp layers of decay. Small reptiles part the fern beds with a sibilant hush. Above, pterosaurs cross on wide wings, their shadows moving like clouds. Among the trunks, small feathered hunters pass where light is dappled, their feet almost silent, their breath small and regular. Every now and then the forest answers with resin, a tear from wounded bark, amber in the making, catching a struggling gnat in a fleck of dust and the smell of its own future. Resin is this world's signature, chemistry written as scent. When heat builds, it loosens into the air, with a sweetness that is not sugary, but pine clean, slightly bitter on the tongue if you breathe deeply enough. The trees may have made it as armor against boring mouths and fungal invasion, and yet it becomes time's glass. In some future cliff, a golden bead will be cracked from rock and held against sunlight, and there you will see ancient air as bubbles, ancient bodies as miniature sculptures, ancient colors preserved as tiny flags across lost wings. In the forest of its birth, though, resin is immediate, a glaze on a wound, a varnish catching a constellation of dust motes that spin when a sunbeam moves. Soils here carry a different music of life. Without grasses, which will later stitch land together with an underground velvet of roots, the floor is mostly needles and fronds breaking down under the hands of fungi. Mycorrhizae may lace conifer roots in quiet trade, phosphorus for sugars, water for carbon, an economy as old as forests themselves, stable and mostly unseen. Termites, if present, are early and few. The heavy work of wood's return to soil falls to beetles and to fungal threads that hum in silence. In this chemistry, nutrients move slowly, which might be why the giants above grow patient rather than hurried, adding rings without rush, building towers that will stand for centuries if storms are kind. Water writes much of the plot. Monsoons return with clock-like insistence, smudging horizons and braiding the air with rain so warm it feels like memory. After weeks, rivers swell and overflow into floodplain lakes, where horsetails grow thick as combs. Much later, when those lakes ring with drying shorelines, mats of ferns roll out in sudden green to claim new ground. The canopy hardly notices, steady in its own longer cycles, but the understory is a quick improviser, 1,000 small hands catching the light that trickles down in coins and spending it immediately on growth. In drought spells, the forest does not brown all at once. It tightens, reduces luxuries, holds in resin, then loosens again when the first thunder speaks from far inland, and the smell of wet dust runs ahead of rain like a herald. Herbivores live in this architecture like weather systems with legs. Sauropods move through the higher reaches where their necks can find fresh tips and soft cones. Stegosaurs and their cousins graze the mid-layer with careful mouths, stripping fronds and leaving stems to catch light for regrowth. Small, nimble beaks pick seed-like bodies where ginkgos have dropped their fruit, their flavors sharp or slightly rancid depending on the chemistry of the day. Plants answer with defenses, not furtive whispers but full-throated strategies. Cycads pack toxins in their tissues, a bitter grammar that discourages casual bites. Some conifers saturate needles with compounds that taste like warning, that burn the tongue and teach a lesson even a big mouth can learn. Yet the mouths keep coming and the plants keep making more, and the dance continues, slow but relentless, life testing life in a way that rarely spills into drama and often settles into coexistence. Light behaves differently here. The canopy's plates and whorls emit sun in clean shafts that drift with the day, painting bright ellipses on the forest floor where seedlings race each other in miniature, rooting fast into soft layers before shadow returns. At dawn the air is silver, fronds wet with heavy dew that magnifies every hair and spore case. By late morning, sparkle gives way to a diffuse gold that warms bark into scent and brings out subtle colors where you thought there were none. Olive on the underside of a cycad leaflet, blue cast along a ginkgo vein, a quiet bronze where an old needle bed has just begun to tan. The afternoon can go heavy, cicada buzzed perhaps, the shade thickening as humidity rises, until a breeze slides in scented with river and lifts the needles into a single hush. Fire visits, not as a stranger but as a periodic companion. Needles laid thick for years can catch like dry snow, and a lightning strike on a high ridge will run fire downhill in thin, whispering sheets. Some conifers may even prefer the aftermath, cones opening to heat, seeds falling into blackened clarity where light reaches soil unfiltered. Ferns are famously resilient. Within days of a burn they can reappear as green scribbles along charcoal lines, their first fronds coiled like fists that gradually relax. To a modern eye this might look harsh. To a Mesozoic forest, it is a breath cycle. Inhale of growth, exhale of flame, inhale again. Because there are no flowers yet, at least not in any abundance, there is less color-coded to specific interactions and more pattern-coded to general survival. Leaves are often tough, built to last through drought spells and to stand up to herbivore mouths. Shapes tend toward the repeatable needles that reduce water loss, fan leaves that present a broad surface and then discard it cleanly, fronds that can be entirely rebuilt from a curled base if the top is taken. There is elegance in this conservatism. Structures are modular, growth is incremental, failure is rarely catastrophic, because most investments can be made again next season when the rains return. Insects, though already ancient masters, are solving their days without the lavish nectar economies that flowers will one day sponsor. Beetles flourish in wood and cone, in rotten rind, in galleries that turn a dead log into architecture. Dragonflies hunt over ponds, their compound eyes writing a mosaic the world fits into perfectly. Their nymphs sit in silt, thoughtful and patient, each predatory strike a soft punctuation in a sentence of stillness. Early wasps and flies find roles along sap flows and fungus blooms. The air is busy, but its business smells of sap and wet bark more than of honey. You can feel evolution storing up questions here. The moment before a conversation begins, the brief hush before an orchestra raises bows. The absence of grass is not a lack so much as a different grammar of land. Without its binding mat, soils crust and soften with the seasons in a way that leaves tracks, legible footprints stamped and later edged by rain. Stories pressed into clay and then, with luck, translated to stone for us to read. Open ground is not a lawn, but a mosaic of ferns and low shrubs, of horsetail colonies that rise and fall with water tables, of bare, resin-scented floors that feel like quiet chapels beneath the great columns. When herds pass, they do not shear a turf. They thread between trunks and frond thickets, pruning height more than carpet, opening light wells that briefly favor quick colonizers before the usual order returns. Not every forest is the same. Near coasts, the air carries salt and the ground runs sandy, with conifers adapted to lean soils, standing slightly crooked where wind holds them all winter. Inland on floodplains, the ground is dark and forgiving, a quilt of channels and levees where cycads cluster like councils. In uplands, the conifers stand farther apart, their roots gripping stone that remembers ancient seas. Lichens paint the rocks in quiet flags, nascent soils collect in pockets, and the wind is the daily architect of who can stay and who must go. Far north and south, astonishingly far by our standards, forests persist too, the greenhouse climate carrying mildness almost to the poles. There the year balances differently. Months of long light, months of long dusk. Growth rings, if we could slice a trunk and hold it up to the sky, might sometimes blur in steady warmth, and sometimes record a faint seasonality, enough of a pause to say yes, a year passed, but not enough to bite. At night the forest seems to inhale. Temperature drops a little, scents gather, resin grows louder on the air. Spores release in subtle pulses that might coincide with these cool hours, when the damp can carry them farther along ground-level currents. Small mammals, shrew-like, careful, testing every step, move under the fern lace, plucking seeds and insect bodies, their whiskers sketching the world one tremble at a time. A feathered shape pauses on a low branch, head cocked, listening to the faint hiss of beetle jaws inside wood. Somewhere water glows thin in moonlight, and a horsetail bank looks like a row of brushstrokes done in one sure hand. When flowers finally arrive in numbers, they will not erase this forest. They will complicate it, color it, quicken it in new ways. But the pre-flower world, leaves a temperament in the land, a patience that later ages inherit even as they move faster. Look at a pine today and you can still feel it, an old composure, a resin memory, a habit of standing through many weathers without dramatics. That habit was learned here, beneath long whirled branches, over soils built by quiet threads, in air that smelled of salt and sap, and the first distant hint of something sweet that had not yet named itself. It is tempting to call this world simpler, but the simplicity may be ours, born of distance. Up close, the network feels busy and precise. Every cone scale has a reason. Every fronds division solves a problem. Every resin tear is both defense and investment. And for us, a letter slipped into the future's pocket. If it lacks the riot of forms that flowers will bring, it makes up for it with a steadiness that nourished giants and roofed whole continents. And the mood of it, this is perhaps the most important thing, was calm, more often than not. Warmth and rain, wood and shadow, the slow talk of roots and fungi, the conversation of wind with needles and plates. Time stacks here without hurry. A tree falls, its roots levering up a dark oval that becomes a pool, and then a fern garden, and then a ginkgo sapling's chance. The gap in the canopy closes in years rather than months. The memory of the fallen trunk persists in soil that stays softer, richer, a long echo that feeds lives not yet imagined at the moment of impact. In a corner of the forest, an old conifer develops a hollow, and things move in, a layered tenancy of insects, whatever small birds existed then, perhaps even a roost for a pterosaur that doesn't mind the resin smell so long as the hollow faces east into morning. We step back out of the green and feel sun more directly, as if the forest had been a cool room. Our clothes smell faintly of resin, of dust shaken from fern undersides, of river carried in the hem. The wind shifts, and for an instant there is a whisper that might be spores released, or only leaves agreeing among themselves to turn their faces toward late light. Somewhere a cone opens, somewhere a frond unrolls another segment, somewhere a newborn leaf completes its fan and the day, content with the company of old designs, becomes evening. Hold the map in your mind, then loosen your grip. The lines do not stay put. Continents are not anchors, but rafts of stone, carrying forests and rivers and whole climates along routes that look, from our fast lives, like stillness. Yet, over millions of years, add up to oceans opened, mountains raised, and coasts redrawn, with a patient, tidal certainty. In the Mesozoic, this movement may have been the quietest force shaping life: sea, stone, and sky, rearranged by plates gliding on the warm mantle's slow currents, a choreography too spacious for a single lifetime to notice, but written everywhere once you step back far enough to see. Pangaea, at first, is a single breath held, a supercontinent from pole to pole, its interior dry and seasonally extreme, its edges washed by a girdling ocean. Then hairline cracks appear. The way glaze on a bowl can craze without breaking, rift valleys opening by degrees, long trenches bordered by scarps where summer thunderstorms echo. Those valleys fill with lakes that lengthen and merge, red beds laid down in heat and flood, mud flats drying into tiles that keep the footprints of passing reptiles as if the earth were a notary with nothing but time. Basalt pours from fissures in episodes that might last years or centuries, stacking in dark stair steps, the air thick with hot mineral scent, sulfur, iron, a hint of brine when groundwater flashes to steam. One day and then 10,000 such days, and the cracks deepen, the floor of the rift sags, a thin ribbon of sea slips in on a high tide. The land cannot fully return. This is one way an ocean begins, not with a sudden rush, but with a trickle that the planet gently and inexorably encourages. Water's arrival salts the new basin, evaporites bloom in dry spells, crystals like frost forming on mud that will soon be submerged again. The shoreline is undecided, moving nightly by meters and millennia by hundreds of kilometers, dampening and drying reeds, laying down gypsum, teaching future stone to remember the taste of tides. Along these margins, the first Atlantic might have felt like a string of inland seas breathing together, each pulse a small argument resolved by the same verdict: more water, deeper water, a coast learning its curve. The more the supercontinent relaxes its hold, the more climate softens, Big landmasses breed deserts at their centers. Smaller continents with more edge per area welcome moisture inland. Monsoons that once ran like lions across the interior begin to fragment into gentler patterns. Forests can reach farther. Lake chains persist instead of blinking out each dry season. Migration routes thread through new green where only red dust lay before. You can feel this change as an easing in the ribs. A long exhale, afternoons less merciless. Nights a little kinder, storms less like interrogations and more like conversations with warm rain. On the far side of the old land, the Tethys Sea glitters, a warm arm of ocean stretching between northern and southern continents. Its shelves wide, its islands scattered like punctuation. Currents drift through it with a Mediterranean patience, carrying larvae and plankton and the tiny glass houses of radiolarians that will in time settle as white whispers on the seafloor. The Tethys is both highway and nursery. It's a place where reefs ramify and ammonites diversify and where small tectonic fragments, microcontinents, smiling and self-possessed, wander and sometimes collide gently with larger lands, raising ridges that will later become the opening lines of mountain belts, whose main verses lie ahead. To the south, the great raft of Gondwana, Africa, South America, Antarctica, Australia, India, and islands. Caught between begins its own loosening. River systems that once converged now diverge. Fish find themselves on one side of a future ocean, their cousins on the other. Sahel-like belts drift poleward. Fern prairies become forest margins, and then in places coasts. India slips free like a seed from its cone and starts north, carrying its own private climate, its own lineages of plants and animals, its own future collision that will someday fold the sky up into mountains of snow and thin air. For now it is a swift raft in geologic terms, crossing low latitudes under a sun that makes days feel long and ripe. Where plates meet, stone buckles and melts. Subduction zones chew old seafloor and return it to the mantle. And above that slow trench, arcs of volcanoes write their beadwork, peaks strung along coasts like a flaming necklace. Ash falls on conifer crowns, turning them grey for a day, then feeding soils for a decade. Rivers carry the fine glass far inland. Lakes grow fertile in pulses after each eruption. In such settings life can feel shocked and then rewarded. A rhythm that if spaced by centuries might even seem like tradition. The Andean margin may have begun its long story here, one rumble at a time. On the opposite rim, island arcs step across the Pacific, on foundations laid and relaid, as plates slip beneath one another. The world's biggest ocean acting both ancient and new at once. Meanwhile, on the newborn floor of the Atlantic, magma wells up along a seam and cools into fresh basalt, a ridge that runs like a stitched scar between diverging continents. Water meets hot rock in sudden chemistry, black smokers breathing mineral-rich plumes, chimneys accreting like stone corals, microbes taking the sunlight-independent deal that vents make possible. Every time the crust splits a little more, new rock records the planet's magnetic mood in cooling crystals. Tiny compasses frozen in the direction the field held that day. The ocean quietly builds a barcode of stripes on either side of the ridge, a symmetrical memory of growth that no one will read until long after the Mesozoic's lights dim, but which sits there already, meticulous and patient. The sea's own accounting of drift. Sea level has its own long tide. In warmer stretches, with few or no polar ice caps, the ocean swells and overtops low places on the continents. Epiric seas spread inland, shallow and bright, their floors flat, their shores shifting with each storm. What will later be the heart of North America will, for a while, be two long islands parted by a warm inland sea, where sharks cruise and mosasaurs, when they come, will write curves under flocks of seabirds. Europe will be a necklace of limestones and lagoons. Chalk so soft under fingernail, so pure in its whiteness, will accumulate grain by grain from the bodies of plankton that turned sunlight into shells, summer after summer after summer, until cliffs stand where quiet water used to be. The white that will later greet sailors is the condensed patience of mid-Mesozoic seas. Drift changes migratory math. In the early days, animals could walk from one horizon to another without a swim. Later, water asks for wings, for rafts of vegetation, for lucky timing when the distance narrows. Lineages that were one begin to split. The same general body plan answering local climates in local dialects. A horn thicker here, a crest more elaborate there, feathers darker where nights grow long, skeletons lighter where air is thin and rising thermals sweeten the sky. Provincialism, life adapting to neighborhoods, blooms as the streets multiply. The planet grows more cosmopolitan and more local at once. Rifts do not only make seas, they make long, deep lakes hemmed by cliffs, places where seasons write sharp contrasts, and fossils are pressed with unusual fidelity. Imagine a calm morning on such a lake in the early Jurassic. The surface is a pane of light. Insect wings pencil ripples on it, then erase themselves. A small theropod drinks at the margin and leaves delicate tracks that a mid-afternoon squall will fill with silt and seal. On the lakebed, an annual snow of fine particles builds valves. Dark, light, countable years, laid flat like pages. Fish die and drift, leaves settle and retain their veins. Even insect husks make it down, sometimes without losing their lace. In the deep water, where oxygen struggles to reach, the dead meet slow chemistry rather than fast teeth, and the record of 1,000 ordinary days ends up extraordinary in stone. As the continents pull apart, weather systems find new fences and new gates. The Tethys breathes moisture northward and southward along corridors that did not exist before. Summer lows roll up new coasts and spill rains farther inland. Winter highs move differently over oceans than they do over rock. Inland deserts shrink and then relocate. Not gone, but translated mountain ranges, growing along compressional boundaries, cast rain shadows, and make wet testaments on their windward flanks. Snow still falls on high volcanoes, even in a greenhouse world. Glaciers may be rare and fleeting, but altitude keeps certain fidelities, and cold streams come down in narrow, brilliant lines, through forests that smell of resin and old ash. Life notices all this in a practical way. Plants migrate seed by seed along the new contours. Conifers grip cliffs where the coast has just broken, and take salt in stride. Cycads colonize sandy spits that will be islands by next century's storms. Dinosaurs adjust the timing of their movements as coastal plains swell and drain. Herd paths shift a valley or two over. Nesting beaches become nesting bluffs. Pterosaurs learn the new ridgelines, as if they were lines of poetry. A fresh set of places where wind turns upward and stays usable all day. In the water, currents rearrange the buffet. Upwelling zones appear in new places, pulling deep nutrients into the sunlit layer where plankton bloom and everything above follows. Volcanic episodes leave punctuation marks in this long paragraph. There are intervals when degassing from spreading ridges and mantle plumes raises atmospheric carbon dioxide and tilts the climate warmer by a notch or two. Intervals when the ocean, layered and calm, struggles to exchange its deep breath, and black muds stack up in places where, for a while, decay falls behind deposition. These anoxic spasms write dark bands into marine rocks, a shadow script that says the sea held its breath, and then eventually let it out again. The biosphere may stagger a little under such shifts, then find a new footing, then revel in the warmth, until the next slow adjustment asks for updates yet again. The human hand loves clean borders, but the Mesozoic planet prefers gradients. The Atlantic does not appear at noon on a Tuesday. It grows from brooks to bays to seas. You could cross in a week by wing, then a month, then a voyage that would outlast a lifetime if lifetimes were as short as ours. Africa and South America do not separate like books pulled from a shelf. They decide, then pause, then decide again, leaving behind matched coastlines and matching rocks, and salt basins that tell later of a long briny adolescence. Australia and Antarctica cling through much of the story, sharing forests, where months of polar twilight require strategies of patience, evergreen habits, slow metabolism, perhaps insulating fuzz on the small ones, and the willingness in the big ones to stand still and let the blood keep its heat a little longer. Stand on a Cretaceous cliff late in the day, and you can feel the newness, even if you cannot name it. The wind runs unimpeded over a sea that was not here in the Triassic. The sun falls into water at a place where, long ago, therapsids trod red flats under hard light. Offshore, a low island hums with pterosaur colonies, On the horizon, a plume marks a volcano whose ash will dust the inland forests by morning. Gulls do not exist yet, but something like a gull teeth in its beak, feathers imperfect but earnest, works the line where small fish leap. Behind you, inland, a range is rising grain by grain, the crust shoved, buckled, and lifted toward a future where it will grab clouds and wring them out into rivers. The odd thing is, how quiet it all feels. Drift is not dramatic to the senses that live daily. A nest is still a nest. A meal is still a meal. A summer still runs out, and a winter still idles in with a different light. And yet, over the long arc, the stage is undeniably moving. The same herd path that once ran along a river now runs along a tidal creek. The same reef that once faced open ocean now sits in a lagoon behind a barrier island. The same mountain that once was a hill is now a snowline rumor. The players change costumes because the theatre is under construction while the play goes on. What the drifting continents offer, perhaps most of all, is possibility. New shores multiply the fringe where life is especially inventive. New basins tweak the chemistry of seas and ask different questions of shells and skeletons. New mountain shadows invite different forests to try the slope. When we think of the Mesozoic as an age of experimentation, we can partly thank this steady tectonic generosity, the planet setting new tables and letting evolution choose the meal. By the time flowers begin to speak in color and sugar with real conviction, the world is already rearranged into rooms that suit their ambitions. Coasts are long, winds are varied, insects are many, birds are practicing flight in earnest. The Cretaceous will take advantage, blooming not only in petals, but in geography, in inland seas that slice continents, in chalk summers that lay down white like snow that never melts, in coral and bivalve cities that pattern entire shelves. The map we carry now is still far off, but its bones are present, lines and curves that our eyes would recognize if we could skim above them on a warm wind at noon, and then instead of landing, keep going, over water that was once land, over land that was once trench, following a story the stones have been telling quietly all along. Color enters quietly at first, a small experiment under the conifer canopy, a modest petal unfolding where only spores and cones had spoken before. It doesn't announce itself with trumpets, it suggests a pale star shape that opens when the air warms, a cup whose rim holds a fragrance not of resin but of something softer, maybe honeyed, maybe green and peppery, drifting a little on the late morning breeze. In a world that has long thought in needles and fans, this is a new grammar: sugar as persuasion, pigment as morris, shape as invitation. Flowers, once rare and almost shy, begin to try the light. The setting is favorable. The continents have loosened, shorelines are long, climates run warm and generously wet in many belts. Insects are everywhere, already intricate. The first angiosperms may have kept to the understory, small and opportunistic, spreading into the gaps that big-shouldered conifers left behind after storms or fires. But the advantages they carry, fast growth, flexible forms, seeds wrapped in food, partnerships with pollinators, are the sort that compound. Within a few tens of millions of years, the forest palette changes, not by erasing but by layering. Conifers still hold long horizons in many places, cycads persist as armored elders, ginkgos keep their calm fans, and yet, among them, an expanding chorus of leaves with varied shapes, thin and efficient, begins to capture sun with haste and to shed it just as quickly, making soils rich with seasonal litter and inviting a quicker rhythm of life. Pollination is where the story feels most intimate. Before petals, plants cast their hopes to the wind, pollen in great clouds, spores as dust. Now many flowers try a different accounting. They make a small sweetness and trade it for fidelity. Beetles come first, perhaps, ancient and sturdy, crawling deep into warm, faintly fragrant chambers within primitive blooms, their bodies dusted orange with pollen. Flies, some drawn to odors that we might label musky or strange, visit discreetly and carry grains on bristled legs. Wasps, clever and alert, take their share and become accidental couriers. And then, bees descended from hunting wasps who lost interest in prey and found devotion in pollen. Their hairs accumulate electrostatic charge, their eyes notice patterns beyond human blues and reds. Their lives organize around the reliable overlap between a flower's offering and a hive's hunger. If the earliest bees look simple compared to the master masons of later ages, they already know the essential trick. Fly a circuit, carry a message, turn a landscape into a map of return. The flowers answer. Petals experiment with color, yellows first, then creams and browns. Perhaps faint purples and shaded spots, and later more saturated notes as chemistry becomes bolder. Patterns appear that bees might read better than we do. Ultraviolet road signs painted in pigments that guide a landing precisely to where pollen is stored or nectar is held. Shapes vary as function requires open bowls for generalists, narrow tubes for visitors with long tongues, clustered sprays for precision work. Some blooms open at night, pale and generous, their scent spilling farther in cool air for moths, whose wings catch moonlight in soft flashes. Others hold their doors until the sun is warm and the midday shift hums with bees. Wind pollination does not vanish. A pine still throws its golden smoke across a ridge, but within sight of that ridge, a thicket of flowers writes statistics of its own, and the numbers favor those who ask for help and reward it. Once pollen delivery grows reliable, seeds become investments worth protecting and promoting. Angiosperm seeds are packaged not merely for survival, but for travel and for taste. A berry adds water and sugars to the cause, and invites a passing beak. A dry pod makes a rattle, a turnstile that opens when air is very dry, and flicks seeds into sun-warm dust. A wing twirls a maple-like fruit in a small helicopter's spiral. A burr finds benefit in fur. Even this early, fruit is a quiet handshake between plant and animal, one that could have included small mammals with sensitive noses, birds testing new diets, and perhaps a few opportunistic pterosaurs browsing soft pulp, where a branch leaned over a legume. The price plants pay, carbohydrates, sometimes fats, sometimes curious flavors, comes back to them as distance covered and as seeds deposited in ready-made packages of fertilizer. A forest that once relied mostly on wind and chance now adds legs and wings to its distribution network. Insects, long the authors of 1,000 survival strategies, move into a different kind of abundance. Beetles diversify alongside angiosperms, chewing leaves, mining stems, boring wood, living within flowers' private rooms, as both partners and thieves. Flies take on new roles, as pollinators and as guests. In the complicated warm niches that flowers create, wasps splinter into lineages that hunt among leaves and others that barely hunt at all, trading stingers for pollen baskets. Butterflies, at least in their ancestral forms, begin to whisper their presence. Later they will bloom into the showy forms we recognize, but even their quieter cousins likely found nectar rewarding and flowers appreciative. Spiderwebs absorb this energy, catching those who misjudge, stitching flowered light into their lattices with patient geometry. The air above a Cretaceous meadow is busy, audible, scented, a choreography of precision flights that, seen from a small distance, reads like a single fabric shivering in sun. Herbivores notice, and the conversation at their mouths becomes more complex. Many flowering plants grow fast and soft compared to their gymnosperm neighbors. They are reachable, palatable, a dependable green under the old shade. Hadrosaurs, with dental batteries arranged like mills, may have ground angiosperm leaves and stems as efficiently as they ground conifer needles and horsetail pith. Ceratopsians, those later masters of cropped fields, might have favored certain broadleaf patches when rains made them abundant. Ankylosaurs, low to the ground and careful, would have found young shoots at the margins where light slants in. Grasses, tiny and quiet at first, may already have appeared in some corners late in the Cretaceous, a whisper in the understory. Not yet prairies, their silica grit a new test for teeth. We are cautious here, because the fossil record speaks in hints, but the hints suggest a mosaic gymnosperm rooms, still dominant in many landscapes, angiosperm rooms multiplying at their edges, animals moving between them the way we move between neighborhoods that smell slightly different at dusk. Plants defend themselves with chemistry and architecture, and the new players write bolder recipes. Tannins darken leaves and make the mouth hesitate. Alkaloids add bitterness or worse. Latex gums a jaw, clogs a mouth part, makes a slug reconsider its schedule. Spines lengthen along stems, hairs roughen surfaces, leaves turn tough and small, where browsing is persistent. In response, mouths become more complex, guts more canny, foraging strategies more nuanced. A herd might graze heavily, one patch, and then shift before toxins accumulate in their own blood. A solitary browser might learn which leaves taste bitter after noon, and return in morning when saturated dew dilutes the warning. There is no malice in any of it, just negotiation at scale. Forest light changes in the company of angiosperms. They tend to leak brightness downwards, growing quickly and letting leaves fall often, making dapple that moves as breezes do, and then making mulch, where mushroom threads tangle in thin nets. This litter, less resinous than conifer needles and more easily digested by fungi, may have accelerated soil cycles, carbon down, nutrients up, so that certain areas grow soft with fertility and others, uphill or inland, remain austere. Rivers notice such differences. Banks held by root mats fray less, channels meander, split, rejoin, draw loops the water remembers. Floods leave silt rich in plant fragments. Seedlings race to catch the temporary light on bars of sand. A tangle of roots builds within a season what will be a future terrace. Some geologists suspect that leafier canopies and denser undergrowth modulated runoff, smoothing storm pulses into longer, lower curves. Even if the effect was gentle, it might have mattered to animals who timed their lives to where and when water stayed. Fire also shifts its habits. Fine fuels from fast-falling leaves and twigs complement the older, heavier fuels of dead conifer branches. When lightning walks a ridge in late summer, the flame it writes may run thinner and more frequent, licking through grass-like herbs and low shrubs and leaving trees singed but standing. In the aftermath, flowers often seize the moment, seeds cracked by heat, dormancies ended, soil open to light and damp. A season after a burn, a slope can wear a necklace of blooms, each color a different wager on pollinators' preferences, each scent a ready-made advertisement that resumes the old contract with wings and legs. The rhythm growth, burn growth, becomes another kind of breathing the land accepts. It is easy, with petals fresh in the mind, to imagine the Cretaceous turning into a world that looks like ours, but the transformation is patchwork and gradual. Conifer rain still sings on scales of bark, cycads still lift armors into light, ginkgo alleys still hold their fan-shaped equanimity. In many places the canopy is mixed, the understory complicated, the edges vibrant, the center steady. Angiosperms dart forward along river corridors and lake margins. They keep to warmer belts. They push toward poles during peaks of global warmth and pull back a little when climates wobble. In the far south and north, long-day summers fill short-season plants with urgency, while long twilights of winter ask evergreens to hold their nerve. In such places, a flower's plan must fit an odd clock: rush in spring, move quickly in summer, hide as seed in autumn, and wait in root through the quiet months, while the wind learns to be patient. Birds, still toothed in many lineages, likely play their part in this story. Feathers handle pollen poorly compared to smooth insect cuticle, but beaks, even toothy ones, can carry fruits, and crops can hold seeds long enough to deliver them beyond the shadow of the parent tree. Some early bird lineages may have shifted into frugivory, at least seasonally. Others stuck to insects and became, without knowing, gardeners anyway. A flock feeding at the edge of a clearing adds motion to color. When they lift, seeds spill like punctuation and write their quiet commas onto open soil. Pterosaurs, especially smaller or more generalist forms, may have plucked berries between fish hunts, reperching with the satisfied, slightly sticky beak we can imagine without certainty, but with permission from how opportunity often shapes appetite. Smell becomes a major language of the land. Volatile compounds float between leaves and visitors, between wounded tissue and would-be predators. Between one plant and another, as signals of drought or herbivory pass in faint plumes. Stand in a Cretaceous thicket at midday and the air might feel layered, one sweetness like warm apples, another like spice, a resinous bass note from nearby conifers, a sulfur hint from trampled horsetail at the stream margin. Many of these signals are not meant for us, yet they pass through us, changing the way we think of green as we stand in it. Insects trace these threads with resolve. Small mammals twitch their whiskers and decide. A dinosaur lifts its head and samples the next breeze before taking a step that will feel wiser than it looks. The consequences for landscapes add up. Angiosperms' appetite for light and talent for fast colonization stitch hill slopes after landslides, bind dunes where the coast is restless, and tile floodplains after late storms. Their leaves darken canopies in certain belts and may draw a little more heat, intensifying afternoon thermals that pterosaurs and birds learn to ride. Their water use patterns, quick to pull, quick to release, could have turned some air masses moister, seeding clouds in mid-afternoon where mornings kept their promises too well. We do not need to be certain to feel the plausibility. A planet is always a single system with many rooms, and a change in one room can make a hallway draft that the next room learns to love. By the late Cretaceous, the bloom is not a rumor, but a presence. In some regions, angiosperms dominate lowlands. In others, they thread with conifers and cycads in complex tapestries. The insect fauna reads like a freshly opened encyclopedia, many pages annotated with pollen. The dinosaur world is lush at the edges, grass still modest, but herbs abundant, leaf forms varied enough to demand new mouth strategies. Amid this, chalk seas lay down white from the rains of microscopic plankton shells, a reminder that ocean light remains the foundation below these colors. Inland seas split continents and bring coastal weathers into the heart of land. Warmth persists with its long, permissive hand, though there are moments when the planet stumbles, brief anoxic pulses in the ocean, intervals of volcanism that smoke the air, followed by rebalancing acts where forests and flowers pick up where they left off. If you could stand in a clearing near the edge of an inland sea on a calm evening, the day's summary would be written in layers your body could read. The visual layer: small blooms at ankle height, feathery foliage rising to the waist, a few broad leaves at shoulder level catching the last light, conifer silhouettes beyond. The auditory layer: insects pitching higher as the air cools, the occasional dry clack of a seed pod splitting, wing beats from a bird with teeth settling into a low branch, a distant splash. The olfactory layer: green and a little sweet, with a smoky memory from last week's ground fire, and a faintly sour note where a fruit fell and is turning into soil. The tactile layer: air moving enough to touch your forearms, the ground slightly springy with litter, a prickle where a herb stalk brushes your calf and says plainly, "Don't chew me." Somewhere nearby, heavy bodies move with courtesy among stems. Farther off, a shadow crosses, the soft triangle of a pterosaur heading toward a ridge. The scene does not insist on itself, it offers. The arrival of flowers does not explain everything about the Cretaceous, but it nudges much of it toward quickness and variety. Strategies multiply, relationships tighten, landscapes become more patchwork, more seasonal in their small moods, even when the big mood of climate remains warm. In the fullness of this afternoon age, when color and scent have joined resin and spore, the planet feels newly articulate. It is not louder than before, only more conversational, and the conversations between petals and pollinators, between fruits and beaks, between leaves and mouths, and the minds behind them, will survive what comes next, carried forward in seeds and in feathers, to recompose the world again when the lights come back after a long, ash-dim night. At the high edges of the Mesozoic map, the year kept a different rhythm. The greenhouse warmth reached far toward the poles, softening winters and keeping seas liquid, yet the tilt of the planet still insisted on extremes of light, months when the sun refused to set, drifting in shallow circles just above the horizon, painting every trunk and frond in sideways gold. Then months when it barely rose at all, a long blue dusk of deleted day, with stars that seemed closer and a sky that sometimes wore green curtains that rippled soundlessly from ridge to ridge. No great continental ice sheets, not in most intervals, but a steadiness of chill under the darkness, a slowdown that moved through wood and blood like a gentle break. It was a world of mild temperature with severe light, and life. A just forest stood here, improbably to a modern eye, and not as scrub, but as real, layered rooms of green. Conifers with whorled branches made soap high-latitude cathedrals. Ginkgos opened fans that turned dull gold before leaf drop. Deciduous cousins among the conifers, the kind that would later remind us of larch and dawn redwood, likely shed their needles to ride out the long night with less cost. Under them, ferns slept low and tight, their fronds coiled like held breath. Horsetails took the last sun wherever snow failed to settle, then waited. The palate was restrained, but in the long day of summer, it felt lavish simply because it had been withheld for so long. When the sun finally climbed, sap rose, air filled with a resin that smelled faintly sweet, and the forest put on speed. The growth told time in wood. Trunks captured the pulse as rings, broad, generous bands from the endless summer, narrowed, tighter bands where darkness reigned in metabolism. In places, the pattern suggests not frost so much as a careful throttling, a plant's choice to move modestly when the light budget goes thin. On the ground, a layer of needle litter cushioned steps and held the memory of last year's daylight. When a tree fell, it threw a bright surprise onto the forest floor, and in one summer, the gap would fill with saplings that tried their luck at a race that was, even then, measured across years. Decay ran slower in the cool, but it ran. Fungi threaded the shadows, and small beetles made crisp, tidy galleries in the softened wood. Everything breathed to the same metronome of very long dawns and very long evenings. Animals lived within these rhythms with a competence that reads as calm from far away. Dinosaurs at the poles, small clever fawns with large eyes and lightly feathered coats for insulation, seemed to have made the best of dusk-heavy months. They foraged in dimness that never quite became night, testing leaf litter with their toes, tilting their heads to listen for beetle rasp and worm shift. Larger herbivores browsed the summer glut and then adjusted to leaner textures as daylight thinned. Bark here, evergreen needles there, roots turned up by flood and frozen again in the upper soil, until a thaw made them honest food. Whether many of the big ones migrated long distances remains a gentle argument among bones. The land offered enough for some to stay, but corridors of better forage would have drawn others. Perhaps the answer was variation. Some herds holding ground in sheltered valleys, others making patient seasonal circuits along river courses that remembered the sun's path even when the sun forgot them. Feathers were a kindness here, and they might have been common in ways that do not fossilize easily. Insulation is useful even in a greenhouse regime. When the light folds away for months, a downy layer holds warmth close, while filamentous frills along arms and tails make little adjustments to balance in half-light. The small hunters, nimble, low to the ground, eyes forward, probably kept night hours in the long winter, moving carefully at the edge of sound. Their prey was not absent, it had simply shifted schedules. Insects tucked into bark, small mammals navigated by whisker and scent, freshwater fish in unfrozen channels, followed slow currents written by groundwater that remembered the summer. The quiet was a kind of abundance, only in a different tense. Marshes and backwaters kept a steady voice beneath the seasonal chorus. Without deep cold, the water rarely sealed in a hard way. Ice could glaze edges, yes, but midstream held, and in that moving ribbon amphibians and fish found a margin that did not blink. In some southern high-latitude basins of the early Cretaceous, a large archaic amphibian, something like a broad-headed lord of the pool, may have sat in slack-water eddies all winter, mouth opening in unhurried ambush, closing on whatever drifted close enough to become a decision. Elsewhere, in Antarctic uplands of the Jurassic, the lakes probably wore thin lids for part of the winter dark, but light leaked into them from the sides, and the year's slow tilt eventually recalled the sun and broke the glaze. Birds earlier, toothed, yet already feather-light, would have threaded these forests as scouts of the day. In summer they ran errands among cones and early fruits, hunting insects that had themselves learned to exploit the brief glut. In the long dusk, some may have clung to bark and waited out a lean wind, shifting a little to share heat. Calls travelled far in the cold, dry air. A single note held over a river at midnight could sound like a silver wire being drawn between trees. Pterosaurs likely visited coastlines rather than penetrating deep into the interior in the cold season. Thermals are a summer gift at high latitudes, and yet calm days after storms would still offer streeted onshore winds that even a tired wing could use. Light behaved like a kindly tyrant. In the endless day, it let photosynthesis run late. In the long dusk, it withheld full darkness, but denied temperature's generous hand. Predators adapted by building strategies that worked in either mode. Ambush amid the clutter of summer understory, tracking and persistence hunts under winter's open, airy geometry. Herbivores timed their breeding to flood the landscape with young, when plants were most honest with sugar, then shifted to safer corridors in late season, where evergreen mouthfuls could be taken without too much toxin, and where browse accessible under snow was sufficient without becoming a trap. The young, in particular, would have asked for warmth and shelter and schedules kept with care. Valleys cut east-west could receive the day's slim arc longer. South-facing hills caught sun even when sun hid. A herd that knew those theatres did better than one that guessed. Marine edges had their own polar moods. In summer, plankton bloomed with untenable enthusiasm. When long light and nutrients collided, water could turn milky with life so small it looked like a colour rather than a being. That richness climbed the food web into fish that schooled in curtains, into marine reptiles that cut those curtains with broad, efficient flippers, into birds that pelted the surface in frantic white scripts. In winter, the glare of the low sun slid long across grey water and the bloom closed, but migration routes aligned with currents brought fresh lives in from temperate belts, and apex hunters worked edges where different water masses met and made narrow walls of prey. Sea ice, if and when it formed at all, would have been seasonal and local, a thin factory of brine and air that broke up as easily as it formed. The ocean never truly fell asleep. So much of this story, high latitude without heavy ice, seasons told by light rather than bitter cold, lives inside bones in ways we can read if only softly. In some polar dinosaurs, growth appears to pause and resume with a regularity that fits the light cycle. In others it looks steadier, perhaps a sign of strategies that smooth the year's demands. Teeth record. In bands of mineral, a diary of stress and ease. A season of lean brows and long twilight writes itself as narrower daily lines. Even eggshell fragments, if we are lucky, can hint at timing. Clutches laid to take advantage of the first good weeks, hatchlings arriving into floodplain greens that had been waiting under needle litter all winter. The precision is partial, of course. We infer, we compare, we stand in these ancient rooms and try to feel the draft that moved the curtains then. Storms came different here. Summer squalls were long and patient, born from warm seas and carried inland on winds that didn't mind the easy grades of the polar landscape. They wrote water into soil rather than throwing it against stone. Winter lows tracked along coast and darkened the sky for days, but without the bite that modern polar cyclones can carry. After they passed, the air smelled clean. Conifer and a mineral that the tongue could not quite name. In that clarity, tracks hardened, and the forest felt larger than it had the day before, as if the storm had cleaned the glass and we were seeing to the back of the room again. Fire was an infrequent visitor, but it knew the roads. In exceptional dry summers, lightning could run a line of flame along a ridge that had slept for years. The burn was usually patchy in such wet-biased climates, a stippling of charcoal instead of a sheet. Plants that had learned to drop leaves and needles already knew how to return after a scorch. Ferns arrived quickly, as they almost always do, and a year later the black was green, and 2 years later it was a memory at ankle height. In a landscape built for long patience, disturbance read as brief, bright punctuation rather than as a change of subject. There is a special quiet to a high-latitude evening in a greenhouse world. Not the brittle hush of deep frost, not the empty silence of a desert night, but a full, upholstered stillness in which sounds travel, and yet do not echo harshly. From a bluff above a meandering river, one could have looked across to a band of trees that faded as the light bent away, seen a flock of early birds turn as one and drop into a sheltered pocket, watched a distant sauropod shoulder itself through the edge of a grove, as if parting a curtain. Overhead thin clouds shone with pearl, reflecting a sun that was still above the horizon even at midnight. If the aurora stepped out, it did so without fuss, lifting lime-coloured veils, then letting them fall again, a theatre without applause. because the audience was made of participants who needed no clapping to confirm that what they had seen was real. It's tempting to imagine that life here was always hard, an endurance test written by a sky that changed its mind only twice a year. Yet, the more we listen, the more it sounds like competence rather than struggle. The animals of the polar Mesozoic navigated their long schedules with a mix of tactics, some migrating, some staying, some splitting the difference, some hoarding energy in fat and in stillness, others spending it quickly while the sun was generous, some trusting to insulation and habit, others to path memory and the simple logic of south-facing stones. Plants did their version of the same, with leaf drop as a savings plan, resin as a lock on the pantry, root depth as both anchor and ledger. A year was not an obstacle, it was a shape to be inhabited. Day length, more than temperature, might have decided when mouths were busiest and when voices were quiet. In the long light, even nocturnals broadened their hours. In the long dusk, diurnals softened theirs and shared. Predation moved from color cues to motion cues, and back again depending on which half of the year held the perch. The forest changed its scents with the same flip, pollen and green in summer, resin and soil and a faint spice of decay in winter. Rivers acted like metronomes, running a little higher in the bright months, then braided into lower, clearer threads under the long evening. The land overall kept decent, but when the planet tilted into a slightly cooler phase or drift carried the polar forests a few degrees farther from warmth, the system did not collapse. It adjusted by increments, moving tree lines, nudging migration routes, adding days to darkness or shaving them from light. Decades inside these changes may have felt like sameness, centuries like trend, and within that trend, particular winters and summers surely stood out to those who relied on timing. A dark that ran too long, a light that came too late. The memory of such years would have been held in habit. Herds that followed elders did well. Plants that cast seed in wider circles ensured themselves against the vagaries of local weather. Rivers that meandered left old channels that could be reused in new years. It is hard not to think of breath when we picture it. A slow in-breath during the long light, a slow out-breath during the long dusk. Photosynthesis, migration, reproduction. The arc of a feathered hunter's year, the speed of ring-making in wood, everything inhaling and exhaling to a schedule written by the same sun that warmed the tropics into an almost continuous afternoon, and all of it, this competence at the edge of the map, made possible by warmth that did not punish, by seas that never truly froze hard, by a sky that insisted on differences in light but allowed most days to be livable. In that permissive frame, polar ecosystems mastered subtlety. They became worlds of nuance, where timing mattered more than temperature, and where success looked like patience. If we step away now and let the year run on, without us, the forest continues its soft arithmetic. Needles fall and make soil. A young, big-eyed herbivore, furred or feathered or both, finds the one patch where last year's flood left mineral-rich sand and takes its first confident mouthful. A bird with teeth tucks one more berry into its crop and lifts toward a sheltering branch. The river, which has been making its own quiet decisions all along, turns one more fraction of a degree and writes a new letter into its floodplain. Overhead, the aurora fades, or perhaps it intensifies. And then, with a light that is barely a light, the year tilts again. The sun climbs higher, by a few finger widths. The resin smell strengthens. Everything in this calm, high-latitude room leans, gently and together, toward green. By the late Cretaceous, gigantism had matured into something almost serene. The sauropods, those long-necked architects of scale, had not disappeared with the Jurassic. They had merely shifted shape, diversified and spread into landscapes reshaped by drifting continents and flowering plants. Among them rose the titanosaurs, a lineage that seemed to test how far the laws of bone and muscle and metabolism could stretch before they bent back on themselves. If the Jurassic had been the rehearsal of giants, the Cretaceous was the final performance, measured, confident, immense. Picture a coastal plain in what will one day be South America. The air is heavy with humidity. Broad-leaved angiosperms crowd river margins, While conifers still stand further back on higher ground, a herd of titanosaurs moves slowly across the floodplain, their skin marked with subtle scales, their tails like whips trailing dust in long arcs. The ground softens under their weight, each footfall leaves a basin that will fill with water by evening. The sound is not thunderous but persistent, like heavy drums played slowly over and over, until the rhythm itself becomes landscape. Some of these creatures stretch 30 meters or more from head to tail. Argentinosaurus, Patagotitan, Dreadnoughtus. Their names, given by us, speak of awe and resistance, but the animals themselves simply move with patience. Their necks reach outward and upward, browsing foliage that few others can touch, their mouths stripping branches with methodical efficiency. A tree that might take centuries to grow can lose half its crown in an afternoon of sauropod attention, yet the forest does not vanish. It adjusts, angiosperms, quick to regrow, turn defoliation into opportunity. Disturbance creates gaps, gaps let in sun. Sun invites seedlings, seedlings create mosaics that feed not only sauropods but the entire suite of animals that trails behind them. To see them in motion is to understand scale as more than size. Their hearts pump with pressures we can barely imagine, lifting blood up necks that arch like living bridges. Their bones are not solid but latticed, strong as stone yet lightened by air. Each vertebra a cathedral of struts and chambers. Their lungs work more like birds than ours, air flowing one way through a system of sacs that turn each breath into efficiency. Evolution did not simply make them big, it made them possible, a feat of engineering that the Earth seemed willing to support for millions of years. Titanosaurs spread widely, more cosmopolitan than many of their predecessors. They appear in South America, Africa, India, Europe, Asia, even Antarctica's polar forests. Continental drift by then had broken Pangaea into distinct theaters, yet titanosaurs seemed to adapt to each stage. In drier inland basins, they moved between seasonal rivers. In coastal lowlands, they left tracks along tidal flats. In polar regions, smaller but still substantial forms grazed beneath long summer light. Their adaptability might explain their endurance. While other giant lineages dwindled, titanosaurs persisted almost to the end of the Cretaceous curtain. Their herds must have been spectacles of patience. Imagine dozens of immense bodies arranged in loose files, necks swaying slightly with each step, tails carving arcs in synchrony. Calves walked among them, small only in relative terms, still larger than any predator but vulnerable enough to warrant protection. Mothers may have guarded them in loose circles, a living barricade of bone and muscle. Predators, even great tyrannosaurs, would think carefully before testing such defenses. Fossil nesting grounds, some stretching over kilometers, suggest gatherings where hundreds of titanosaurs laid eggs together, scraping shallow pits, covering them with vegetation, letting heat do its quiet work. The hatchlings that emerged must have faced a gauntlet, small, fast, secretive, only a fraction living long enough to join the steady processional of adults. The predators that shared their world sharpened themselves against this abundance. Abelisaurids, in the southern continents, stocky, horned carnivores, likely harassed the young or the weak. In the north, tyrannosaurs grew to their final grandeur, their skulls wide, their teeth thick and meant for bone as much as flesh. Yet even these apex hunters must have known that the great adults were rarely worth the risk. Scavengers followed instead, dromaeosaurs watching the fringes, crocodiliforms lurking in river shallows, insects and mammals ready to pick at the margins of what giants left behind. Every meal a tinosaur made became in some measure a feast for the ecosystem. Their presence shaped the land itself. Trails became corridors. Corridors became habitual routes. Habitual routes pressed so deep into soil that rivers sometimes shifted to follow them. Trees bore scars where flanks brushed them year after year. Bark polished smooth by skin like leather. Soils enriched with dung grew dense with ferns and herbs. Green carpets renewed as quickly as they were eaten. Fire regimes may have shifted under the weight of their grazing. Litter consumed before it could dry to tinder. The giants were not only participants, they were gardeners, engineers, forces of ecology written in footprints that hardened into stone. And what of their senses, their lives beyond feeding? Fossil skulls hint at large olfactory bulbs. Perhaps they knew the world first by scent, reading the air for water, for green, for kin. Their hearing may have been tuned to low frequencies, calls that travelled across kilometres of open land. Imagine a herd strung out along a river, individuals out of sight but not out of touch, rumbling to each other in bass notes that bent through the ground more than through the air. Communication not as spectacle but as reassurance. Here I am here, stay near. The calf lifts its head, ears catching a vibration older than language. Seasons must have carried their weight into motion. In monsoon belts, herds likely shifted with rains, chasing green flushes across plains. In drier climates, they followed rivers that shrank and spread again, moving between drought refuges and flood-rich pastures. Eggs were laid when conditions promised growth. Calves emerged into synchrony with leaf and insect abundance. Timing was survival, and the giants seemed to have mastered it, for their bones tell of persistence, of lives measured not in decades but perhaps in half-centuries, long enough for generations to overlap, and for herds to carry memory as much as muscle. As the Cretaceous aged, titanosaurs diversified further, some enormous, some modest. Saltosaurus, smaller and armored with bony plates beneath its skin, hints that not all strategies required size alone. Defense could be layered, literal. Others, like Alamosaurus in North America, reached back toward titanic dimensions, their vertebrae taller than a standing human. In each lineage, the balance was different: weight against agility, height against metabolic cost, armor against. The earth allowed many answers, and for a time, each answer worked. In their shadows, mammals stayed small but patient, scurrying between roots, nibbling seeds, perhaps stealing eggs when opportunity outweighed risk. Birds darted among the canopies that titanosaurs pulled down into reach. Insects thrived in dung, turning waste into soil. Rivers carried nutrients from grazing grounds to seas, feeding plankton blooms that rose, in turn, into fish, into reptiles, into wings that shadowed the surf. The giants were not isolated marvels, but keystones, the slow engines of an interconnected world. And then, as always, there was fragility. For all their mass, for all their endurance, titanosaurs were still subject to the planet's larger moods: volcanism, climate shifts, and finally, the fall of a rock from space that would darken skies and strip green from the earth. In that ash-shrouded aftermath, a 30-meter neck became no advantage. What survived were those who could hide, endure cold, find scraps. Yet before that ending, for tens of millions of years, the age belonged to the giants. They walked slowly, but their time was long. To stand beside one in imagination is to feel the scale of the planet differently. The ground would tremble faintly with each step. The air would vibrate with the low murmur of their calls. The horizon would tilt when their necks swung. And yet, for all the enormity, the mood might not have been terrifying but strangely calm. Titans moving not with urgency but with the patience of continents, grazing not with hunger but with continuity, embodying in flesh the same deep persistence with which the land itself shifts, grows, and waits. In the middle of the Cretaceous world, the ocean did something intimate. It came ashore and stayed. It flowed across low country, found old river paths, filled basins that had been waiting since Pangaea began to loosen, and it made a sea, not at the edge of a continent, but inside one, the Western Interior Seaway, a ribbon of warm, shallow water that parted a future North America into two long islands, its shorelines breathing in and out with every long rise and fall of global sea level. Other eperic seas formed elsewhere, but this one tells the story clearly: how a sea can be a climate, a marketplace of life, a chalk factory, and a memory written in white stone. Stand on a chalk bluff there, any of the places that would later lift white faces to the sun, and the first thing you feel is brightness. Chalk reflects light with a gentleness that still dazzles, a soft glare that speaks in whispers of countless summers. Each pale grain is a plate from a microscopic alga, a coccolith, made of calcite spun by a cell that turned sunlight and dissolved carbon into frisbees. so thin they float down in snow when the body that wore them is done. Multiply that by millions of summers and storms, by blooms that came and went, like weather, and you get cliffs. You get soft stone that powders under the hand. You get a record of light, made tangible. To walk the top of such a cliff in imagination is to walk an ancient sky that settled. The sea that made these bluffs was not deep in most places. Its bottom lay within the reach of blue light. Its waves could feel the contour of the floor, sandbars braided along coasts that moved each season. Tidal flats shone like mirrors at noon. Storms ran low over the wide water, pushing it into faint, far-travelling domes that arrived at shore as long-limbed waves. On calm days the surface turned to glass, and the plankton below threw a faint cloudiness into the water, as if someone had dissolved milk into the blue. On windy afternoons streaks formed, lines of foam and broken shells, and birds with teeth rode those wind streets, their wings slicing the air like confident signatures. Mosasaurs owned this room in time, the way ichthyosaurs had owned an earlier one, and their shape tells you they were lizards that learned to be water. The body lengthened and streamlined, the limbs widened into paddles, the tail grew a fluke that made speed honest, and the skull reworked itself into a weapon that could open wide and not apologize. Double-hinged jaws, teeth not only on the rim but along the palate, set like backward-pointing guides that ensured prey did not reconsider once it crossed a certain line. They do not need our fear to be impressive, they only need water and a reason, and the seaway gave them both most days. Picture one rising in the green, eye up, the rest of the animal still a rumour, then the boil of a turn, the pressure wave that precedes a strike, and the silence after save for a string of bubbles. Not spectacle every hour, just competence, repeat. Around them, fish thickened the middle waters, sleek, bony, many of them newly modern, the teleosts sharpening their advantages. Schools turned and flashed like coin showers, quick curves that read like sentences in a language made of decisions. Sharks held their old grace in a new venue, prowling edges, taking what panic created. Above, pteranodonts and their kin found lift over the seaway's long fetch, launching from chalk headlands, arrowing out on a line of air, drawn by warm afternoon sun on pale rock. Their shadows crossed rafts of driftwood, where insects rested between misadventures, then crossed again as they returned with fish held lengthwise to cut drag. A small engineering choice that feels like intelligence, because it is. Birds still toothed in many lineages, folded into this life easily. Think of a long-bodied diver with feet set far back, wings that were more for balancing than for flight. Once the plunge was made, and a jaw lined with small, backward-inclined teeth, a creature that slipped into seas like a seal, used its feet to chase, and surfaced with a flick that sent droplets into brief, perfect parabolas. Think, too, of a sharper-winged cousin, at home in the upwinds that blew along chalk escarpments, perched in galleries where the cliff face offered ledges at every height. The inland sea hosted these experiments generously. On certain evenings, when wind fell and the water went grey and flat as pewter, you might have seen lines of such birds heading for roosts, the flight a tidy arithmetic above a world that had spent the day improvising. The shores mattered as much as the middle. Marshes stitched the margins with reeds and ferny herbs. Lagoons behind barrier bars went hyper-salty in late summer, and then reset with a storm. Deltas reached into the sea and made fans of silt where rivers wagged side to side over centuries. Hadrosaurs grazed these fringes, their footprints pressing into wet mud that would dry into pages, the trackways later preserved as if the tide were a binder. Ceratopsians kept to firmer ground just behind the marsh line, their beaks clipping herbs and low branches. Ankylosaurs, cautious, picked roots that offered cover and steady footing. In some seasons, herds moved west to east or east to west as shorelines wandered. In others, they stayed local and let the sea come to them, tolerating salt on the wind, even the occasional glint of brine on leaves after a gale, threw spray farther than usual. Rudist reefs, bivalves that built tall, strange cones, rose in patches along the warmer reaches of the seaway and in other epicontinental waters. Not coral cities so much as shell high-rises, they nevertheless made the same serviceable geometry, walls and rooms, alleys and roofs. shade and current breaks. Fish used them as nurseries. Invertebrates ate the small snow that forever falls in such places. Predators did their rounds thoughtfully, timeshare owners in a landscape that kept resetting itself with growth and storm and growth again. If you dove down, body cooled at once by the slight chill of depth, you would see the water full of suspended things, a visible economy, and the reef itself not a grid but a conversation in relief. Every new shell growing where water suggested it would be happy. Storms were the editors of these coasts. The long fetch of the seaway let wind write waves that could rework a beach in an afternoon. Barrier islands shifted. A channel that had been useful for years could choke with sand during one bad blow, while a new breach opened a mile away as if the sea were offering a fresh doorway. Chalk cliffs lost slabs with a sound you would have felt in your sternum, the falls sending up foam that drifted inland like fleeting snow. After such a day, the air smelled like crushed shells and wet limestone. A mineral sweetness that sat on the tongue the way a thought sits in the mind, half-formed and insistent. And then, because time is long here, calm returned, and the little makers of lime took up their building again in the upper meters where the light is strong enough to make sugars. There were darker intervals too, times when warmth and stillness layered the sea so neatly that the bottom went stale and oxygen ran thin. Black shales record those episodes, pages written with the ink of plankton that died and piled in quiet, records of a sea holding its breath for a while. Life did not vanish, it shifted upward, tucked into refuges, waited where currents still turned over new water. When cooler spells or stronger winds returned, the sea exhaled and the system rewound itself toward bustle. The chalk resumed. The reefs rebuilt. The fish wrote their quick cursive across shelves that had gone briefly empty and were now busy again. Fossils from these days carry intimacy. In the chalk, a fish lies with bones articulated as if sleep simply lengthened into stone. In the thin-bedded dark shales, a mosasaur's skeleton winds like a river, jaws slightly ajar as if the last breath were a sentence you could nearly hear. In limestones that once were reefs, a bivalve still holds the interior spill of sediment, a last filling that honors the shape it kept. Sometimes the record is sudden, a layer of shell hash and broken bone, sorted by a storm into a coarse punctuation mark, a tangle of driftwood pinned at the base of a cliff where a flood delivered a season's worth of trees at once. The inland sea was full of such moments because it lived on the cusp between land and ocean, borrowing drama from both, but usually speaking in the lower register of continuity. Even sound had a character here. Onshore wind made a constant hush, offshore wind turned the beach into a whisper, and pushed ripples out of lagoons like pages being turned. In the water, the click of invertebrate lives. Small jaws, tiny snaps made a low electrical chatter, while larger movements, tail beats, mouth claps, added occasional bass notes. Mossars might have sensed one another in the long waves that bodies make when they cut water well. Schools of fish rid the drum of approaching shape and thickened into fear, then fled as a single mind. At dusk, when the wind softened and heat that had soaked into chalk leaked back out, the seaward face of the coast breathed a coolness inland that felt like relief. The seaway shrank and swelled with long sea-level tides. When warmth peaked and polar ice was absent, it widened. When global climates modulated or crust rose under mountain belts to the west, it narrowed. The land kept track in stair-steps, beach gravels overlain by offshore muds, overlain by lagoon silts, overlain by soils with roots, then again by shore-face sand. It is mesmerizing to read these stacks, each package a short story about a shoreline that wandered, a climate that leaned, a river that moved its mouth. Animals revised their routes with each round. Nesting sites shifted, predators learned new ambush lines, plants tested salinity tolerance at the edges and either adapted or backed away a few ridges. Even the chalk was punctuated by sand pulses when storms ran along the coast, long enough to throw grit far out over the plankton's quiet work. On nights after hot days, phosphorescence probably woke in the nearshore water when a fin or a paddle or a wading foot disturbed the surface. Tiny lights igniting in trails, then fading, then igniting again. A galaxy that couldn't make up its mind. It is pleasant to imagine a young animal bird, small dinosaur startled and then entranced by this, stepping again just to see the brightness return, that same night. Overhead, The Milky Way would be shockingly crisp. A land with few mountains and little dust beyond sea salt must have given stars a stage, and if a pterosaur lifted briefly to change roost and cross that strip of sky, you might have seen a dark hinge move across brightness, then heard the faintest rustle as it settled once more on pale stone. As continents continued their rearrangement, the inland seas of the world played their parts, and then made their exits, leaving behind white stacks and soft powdery slopes that water later carved into badlands. The western interior's retreat was gradual. Estuaries lengthened, tidal prisms weakened, marshes expanded into new ground, and the two long islands of land touched again in a slow hug that closed the waterway. The memory of the sea survived in soils, salts here and there, a chemistry that plants read with caution, and in the broad, easy moods of the climate that persisted for a while afterward, as if the land still thought like water. Chalk, meanwhile, remained a condensed kindness of light. Later ages would cut it, climb it, shelter in caves within it, plant vineyards on it, write with it on boards, crumble it in the hand, and taste that mineral sweetness with no real flavour. Only a sensation that the mouth translates as clean. When you hold a piece of chalk now and draw a line, you're dragging the remains of a quiet blizzard of coccoliths across a new surface, releasing a little dust of summer back into air. The line is fragile. It can be erased with a cloth, but the stone the chalk came from took millions of years, and a sea you could have sailed for days without seeing land. The inland sea taught life how to behave when ocean and continent become one another. It offered long coasts to birds that were learning wind. It offered warm platforms to reptiles that had reshaped themselves into missiles. It offered nursery rooms for fish and daily buffets for sharks. It offered marshes to herds that used sound ground first and wet ground later, and sometimes both in the same hour, and it offered a way for the planet to store light in white ledgers stacked quietly along future rivers, so that even after the sea pulled back and the final Cretaceous night came on, the memory of sun could still be touched. The Mesozoic was a greenhouse age, but greenhouses are not always calm. Heat thickens air, and air, when full of water, becomes storm. Forests full of resin become tinder. Volcanoes exhale gases that change the sky, and the sky in turn changes how every breath feels. When we picture the Age of Reptiles as serene giants grazing under steady sun, we forget the drama in its weather, the sparks in its atmosphere, the tremors underfoot. Yet these dramas came slowly, repetitively, woven into the background like the pulse of a drum. Fire was frequent enough to be familiar, with oxygen levels often higher than today, sometimes by a third or more. Flames burned hotter, spread faster, and climbed taller. A single strike of lightning in a resin-rich conifer stand could send a column of fire skyward that roared like surf. Crown fires leapt from tree to tree, sparks falling like stars onto fern floors, ash coating river surfaces in oily skeins. And yet, fire was not only destruction. Ferns thrived in its wake, unrolling new green carpets on black soil within days. Some conifers may have counted on heat to crack their cones, seeds falling into bare ground where they had the best chance of light. Fire was punctuation, sudden and brilliant, in a story that otherwise ran slowly. Stand on a slope after such a burn and the air would feel strange. Resin ghosts linger in the nose, sharp but not unpleasant. The ground radiates heat even in evening. Black trunks stand like charred columns, but at their bases, new shoots already push. Delicate and defiant, the cycle was not tragedy but rhythm. Growth, burn, growth again. The land exhaling in flame and inhaling in green. Storms were equally relentless. Without polar ice to anchor climate, temperature gradients between ocean and land were extreme. Warm seas exhaled moisture, and when monsoons arrived, they did so with conviction. Rains might fall for weeks, each drop striking broad leaves until the forest floor became a slurry, rivers swelling into wide brown sheets. Thunder rolled for hours, not minutes, its deep voice echoing across low floodplains. Lightning branched through heavy skies, striking water and forest alike, feeding the fires that would later follow when clouds cleared and heat returned. Inland, storms had their own dialect. Dust storms stalked desert interiors, grinding sandstone into red veils that moved like living walls. Winds tore across open basins where nothing stood tall enough to resist. For smaller creatures, such weather was exile, forcing them underground or into crevices. For giants, it was irritation rather than disaster, grit in the eyes and throat, a dull rasp to add to the daily labor of breathing. But when rains returned, the dust hardened into new layers, surfaces ready to hold footprints, maps of animal passage pressed into wet ground. Volcanoes were the slowest and largest storms of all. The Mesozoic saw continents splitting, oceans opening, and plumes of magma rising in curtains that could last 1,000,000 years. The central Atlantic magmatic province poured lava across what would become 4 continents, dark flows hundreds of meters thick, gases seeping into the air like an invisible tide. Sulfur dimmed the sun, carbon warmed the planet in the long term, ash settled over forests, muting them in grey. Some days must have smelled of rotten eggs, the sour bite of sulfur dioxide sharp enough to sting the lungs. Other days carried only a haze, softening the horizon, making the sun an orange disk that slipped through the canopy like a lantern behind smoke. Life adjusted as best it could. Plants dropped leaves and stress, or hoarded resin as defense. Animals moved toward coasts, where breezes diluted fumes. Some perished in the moment, others endured, and their lineages carried forward into calmer centuries. Volcanism was not constant, but it was frequent enough to shape time. The land repeatedly reminded that beneath it lay fire. Breath itself felt different in this age. Higher oxygen meant lighter effort with each inhale, but it also meant fire spread with alarming ease. In certain intervals, even damp wood could flare once sparked. Lungs of animals may have been larger, more efficient, their systems tuned to abundance. Pterosaurs, masters of the sky, could ride thermals lofted by a warm earth with lungs supported by air sacs like bellows, their breathwork far closer to birds than reptiles. Sauropods, massive as they were, breathed with a flow-through system that made each intake more productive than ours, their deep chests rising and falling in patient rhythm as they harvested foliage high above. The air also carried particulates more often than we might expect. Volcanic ash fell like talcum after eruptions, coating leaves, settling in creases of skin, drifting into lakes where it sank and formed thin grey lines in sediment. Smoke from fires turned sunsets into murals, deep crimson, copper, violet. After heavy rains, humidity lifted scents like steam resin, wet fern, the mineral tang of fresh stone where slopes had slipped. For creatures that navigated by smell, the world was a layered text, rewritten daily by fire, storm, and season. Lightning alone was a spectacle, with warmer air holding more moisture. Convective storms towered higher than modern ones, anvils reaching into stratospheric heights. From a ridge you might have seen a dozen bolts in a minute, forks racing across the sky illuminating herds below in brief, silent negatives before the thunder rolled in. Sometimes the strikes hit open ground, vitrifying sand into glassy tubes. Sometimes they hit water, sending shockwaves through fish schools and startling predators upward in sudden lunges. Storms were not only background, they were architects, etching themselves into soil, into stone, into memory. And yet, for all this drama, the age was not restless. Fire and storm were not interruptions, but parts of a broader pattern. Forests grew, knowing they would burn. Rivers braided, knowing they would flood. Herds grazed with an awareness, carried in instinct, that water would come and then go, that thunder would frighten, but also feed. Volcanoes raised mountains, even as they destroyed valleys. Climate shifts pressed lineages toward change, but slowly, with enough warning for many to adapt, catastrophe came. Yes, but mostly at the edges of eras, not in the daily breathing of the age. If you closed your eyes on a Cretaceous plain, you might have felt the air itself as a presence, heavy, scented, dynamic, a low wind carrying pollen one day, a hot updraft the next, then a storm that bent trees like grass, fire glowing in the distance, painting the undersides of clouds, rain falling in sheets that turned dust into mirrors, and then calm again, the breath of earth steadying itself, ready for another long exhalation. The Mesozoic was not only an age of giants and flowers and seas, it was an age of atmosphere alive with energy. Every storm was a rehearsal for renewal. Every fire was a clearing for something new. Every breath was thicker with oxygen, easier but sharper, reminding all life that the air was not empty but a medium, as real as water, as changeable as stone. In the long shadow of giants, another story was being written, quietly, without spectacle, but with persistence. While sauropods moved like moving hills across plains, while tyrannosaurs tested their bone-crushing jaws, while pterosaurs stretched wings wider than small planes, the mammals remained small, secretive, and often nocturnal. Yet in these overlooked hours of darkness and undergrowth, they were rehearsing the roles that would, one day, let them inherit the earth. Imagine kneeling in the underbrush of a Cretaceous forest. Around you the canopy is tall, stitched by conifers, but also pierced by broad-leaved newcomers, angiosperms that spread dappled shade across the ground. In this patterned light, a tiny mammal moves with intent. Its whiskers twitch, mapping air currents too faint for eyes to catch. It presses its belly low, slipping between roots. Its nose finds the faint scent of beetle grubs. With delicate incisors, it scrapes bark, pausing when a larger shadow passes overhead. The forest is loud with insect wings, but mammals hear higher notes, sharper cries. Their world is a layer most giants ignore. The earliest mammals of the Mesozoic were descendants of cynodonts, Permian survivors that had already begun reshaping themselves toward fur, warm blood, and complex teeth. By the Jurassic, they had split into lines with varied habits. Some were insectivores, their teeth sharp and pointed for piercing exoskeletons. Others grew molars that interlocked, good for chewing seeds and plant matter. A few, remarkably, had experimented with gliding membranes stretched between limbs, turning night forests into three-dimensional highways. They were small, yes, often mouse-sized, rarely larger than a cat, but size was not weakness. It was camouflage, flexibility, survivability. Their nights belonged to sound. Large dinosaurs may have filled the day with rumble and crash, but in darkness mammal ears found the important frequencies: the shuffle of an insect in leaf litter, the rustle of a predator's step, the high trill of a frog calling near water. Some mammals may already have had the seeds of ultrasonic hearing, a gift that would one day serve bats. In a world where size-limited strength awareness was currency, and ears were rich organs. Sight adapted too. Large eyes, proportionally wide pupils, tuned for dim light. Movements were quick, jerky sometimes, but precise, guided by vision that favored contrasts more than colors. The stars, when they were visible between forest crowns, must have been astonishing. No city light, no haze, save the volcanic kind. Skies filled with galaxies like rivers. Perhaps the small mammals glanced up sometimes, but mostly their gaze was downward, practical, mapping root to root, insect to seed, shadow to shelter. Their diets were diverse, and with diversity came resilience. One night's meal might be a clutch of beetle larvae, the next fallen fruit from an early angiosperm, the next a froglet too slow to reach water. Some gnawed seeds, caching them instinctively in burrows. Some hunted spiders, cracking their bodies delicately and drinking what was inside. A few may have even risked dinosaur eggs, when chance allowed, puncturing shells and lapping at the soft contents before retreating quickly from the scent of danger. Omnivory, an unfussy palate, kept them alive when more specialized creatures starved. Burrows were common refuges, simple tunnels, lined with grass or fern opening in hidden places. These dens offered insulation against heat and cold, dryness against rain, safety against fire. When wildfires swept through forests, mammals could survive underground, curled in chambers until the world above cooled. When storms drowned low ground, they dug higher. When predators prowled, a narrow tunnel was an ally. Each burrow was both home and archive. Bones, seeds, bits of shed fur, traces of lives invisible to the giants overhead. Reproduction gave mammals another advantage. Unlike reptiles that left eggs to sun or soil, many mammals nurtured young more directly. Even the earliest may have produced milk, simple protein-rich fluid that let newborns grow in safety. Imagine a Cretaceous night, a mother huddled in her burrow, tiny blind pups pressed against her belly, their squeaks almost inaudible, her heartbeat steady against them. Outside, predators call and insects sing, but within that chamber, life's continuity is secure, tender, warm. Insects and angiosperms offered new partnerships. Some mammals fed on nectar or pollen, their fur dusted with grains that carried to the next flower. Others gnawed fruits and dispersed seeds. They became gardeners without knowing it, spreading angiosperms faster than wind alone could manage. Where birds and insects worked by day, mammals added a night shift. The spread of flowering plants was not just a story of bees and beetles, but also of small whiskered couriers moving under moonlight. Predators did not ignore them. Small theropods, feathered, sharp-eyed, pounced in the dark when they heard rustle. Snakes, already experimenting with stealth, slid through litter with tongues that tasted heat and scent. Owls were not yet invented, but pterosaur cousins may have stooped at dusk. Still, mammals endured, because they were quick, cautious, and prolific. One loss did not doom the lineage. Another was already nursing in the next burrow over. Survival was not certain, but it was probable enough. Over time, mammals explored more niches. Some became semi-aquatic, dipping into streams for fish or amphibians. Others climbed trees, grasping bark with flexible digits, tails balancing their weight. Some flattened into gliders, membranes stretched between limbs, sailing silently from trunk to trunk. These were experiments, small rehearsals for futures where wings, fins, and claws would evolve again in more extravagant ways. For now, each experiment brought another option, another chance to remain. The giants overhead probably barely noticed them. Sauropods grazed on branches, oblivious to the rustle below. Ceratopsians thundered across plains, their feet sometimes crushing burrows unseen. Tyrannosaurs focused on prey worth the effort. Duckbills horned beasts, not rodents in shadows. To the giants, mammals were beneath notice. To mammals, the giants were weather. Events to be avoided, forces to be endured, but not central to the business of daily life. This disregard became safety. When the Great Extinction came at the end of the Mesozoic, an asteroid impact, a winter of dust and darkness, the small shadows found their moment. They had always thrived in dusk and night. Now day itself was dusk. They had always been flexible eaters. Now scraps and seeds were enough. They had always hidden underground. Now burrows shielded them from cold and fire. While giants struggled with the loss of abundance, mammals survived on little. Their time had been in rehearsal for millions of years. The curtain finally rose. But in the Mesozoic itself, they were not heirs yet, only careful tenants, sharing a world that did not belong to them. Their lives were measured in heartbeats quick as drum rolls, in generations overlapping like ripples. If you bent close enough, you would see them as essential, nurses of seeds, caretakers of insects, keepers of continuity. To the broad canvas of the age, they were shadows. To themselves, they were the whole story. It began like any other morning. The late Cretaceous world was warm, green, and busy. Herds grazed on wide floodplains. Pterosaurs wheeled above inland seas. Flowers perfumed the air. Bees busied themselves in nectar. Even the giants, titanosaurs and horn-faced ceratopsians, moved with their usual patience. Nothing in their vast, practiced rhythms hinted at what was about to arrive from the sky. 66 million years ago, a rock about 10 kilometers across entered Earth's atmosphere. It came fast, faster than sound, faster than comprehension, faster than the world could prepare. For a moment, the air itself burned. In the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, the asteroid struck, and the planet shuddered. The impact unleashed energy equal to billions of nuclear weapons. Shockwaves tore outward, compressing air into a wall that flattened forests for hundreds of kilometers. The ground liquefied, rebounded, collapsed again. A crater over 150 kilometers wide yawned open, rimmed with broken rock and boiling sea. Tsunamis rushed outward, walls of water tens of meters high, slamming into coasts across the Gulf of Mexico within hours. But the greatest violence was in the sky. Rock and vaporized crust shot upward, piercing the atmosphere, scattering into space. Much of it rained back down as molten droplets. spherules that glowed red-hot as they fell, igniting forests thousands of kilometers away. For minutes, perhaps hours, the world burned. Animals that had survived the initial blast faced walls of flame racing across continents. Resinous conifers went up like torches. Grasses had not yet spread widely, but ferns and angiosperm shrubs flashed into firebrands. Smoke rose in curtains, blackening the sky. And then came the deeper darkness. Dust, ash, and soot lifted high into the stratosphere, forming a shroud around the globe. Sunlight faltered, then dimmed, then failed almost entirely. Day turned into a long twilight. Photosynthesis stalled. Plants withered, flowers closed and dropped their petals, seeds waiting for a spring that did not come. Oceans cooled at the surface as light could no longer reach their plankton. Without plankton, food webs stumbled. Without plants, herbivores starved. Without herbivores, predators followed. The world grew cold, not the sharp cold of an ice age, but the hungry chill of a sunless season. Temperatures dropped quickly. Rain shifted to acid, as sulfur from vaporized rock combined with water in the air. Forest weakened further. Rivers ran grey. Lakes turned sour. The night sky, when it could be seen, glowed faintly with auroras, as the atmosphere reeled from its shock. Stars looked unchanged, eternal, but Earth's own light was gone. In the gloom, survivors clung to niches. Mammals in burrows, reptiles in water, birds with seeds in their crops. These found continuity. Seeds themselves became capsules of patience, enduring in soil until light returned. Ferns, masters of recovery, bided their time underground. But the giants, the great dinosaurs who had ruled for over 150 million years, were too large, too dependent on abundance, too exposed to a season of famine. Slowly, in silence, they passed. Marine reptiles vanished too. Mosasaurs, the sleek lords of inland seas, disappeared as plankton collapsed. Ammonites, those spiral travelers of the oceans, ended here as well, their last shells sinking through dark water to rest on quiet seafloors. Even pterosaurs, long masters of the skies, dwindled and were gone. The Mesozoic closed its book in fire and ash. And yet, life did not end. It folded, adapted, waited. The Earth is resilient in ways that are difficult to measure in human time. Within years, the dust began to settle. Within decades, sunlight returned, weak at first, then strong. Ferns were the first to reclaim the land, their spores spreading across blackened soil. Forests followed, new leaves catching fresh light. Mammals emerged from shadows, more diverse than before. Birds, descendants of feathered dinosaurs, filled the air again with movement and song. What perished shaped what remained. The absence of dinosaurs left space for mammals to expand, to grow larger, to try roles once impossible. The extinction was a wound, but also a clearing. Evolution works with what survives, and what survived was enough to write the next chapters. If you stood invisible in the weeks after the impact, the silence would have been unbearable. No insect choruses in evening, no bird song in morning, no thunder of herds, the air heavy with soot, the rivers running dark, the forest skeletal. And then, a year later, perhaps the first green shoot poking through ash, a fern frond unrolling where fire had scorched, a mouse-sized mammal nosing seeds in the dark, a bird with teeth taking a cautious flight across a grey sky. Small signs of persistence, writing in whispers what thunder had erased. The day the sky fell was the end of the Mesozoic, but it was also the preface of the Cenozoic, the age of mammals. The world had not died, it had turned a page.